She was 23 and homeless. No lease, no mother, no bed, just a dented tin of drawing pencils and $5 she had folded twice inside her left shoe. And with that $5 she bought a forgotten wax seal workshop in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, a place that had fallen off county repair maps in 1978. The roof had opened at the rear seam. The front door hung crooked from one patient hinge. The county had said the building had been closed since 1991 and was scheduled for demolition the following spring. But what nobody knew was that inside the 7th drawer of the stamp cabinet, in a hidden compartment that had not been opened in over 90 years, was something that would change her life forever. Before we continue, if stories like this mean something to you, hit subscribe, and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We love seeing how far these stories travel. Maren Vale had been practicing disappearance her whole life without knowing it. As a child, she learned how to make herself narrow in rooms where adults were counting bills, folding letters, or standing at windows with their hands pressed against their mouths. She learned which floorboards in the apartment complained, which cabinet door caught at the bottom, and how to close the refrigerator softly enough that her mother would not look up from the kitchen table with that careful, worn face. They lived above a laundromat in York, Pennsylvania, where the ceiling trembled every evening from the machines below. The air smelled of dryer lint, hot coins, and the lemon bleach the owner poured too generously into the mop bucket. Ada slept in a corner bedroom with 2 walls painted the color of diluted milk and one window facing an alley where pigeons collected on a telephone wire like notes left by someone who had forgotten the song. She drew on whatever came to hand: receipt backs, paper grocery bags, the white margins of old church bulletins. In winter, when frost made feathers on the inside of the window glass, she copied those patterns with the patience of someone receiving instruction. She liked fine lines before she knew there was a name for that liking. She liked borders, initials, flourishes, hinges, locks, keyholes, door plates, the engraved edges of old coins. Her mother, Maren Vale, worked where work would take her: dental office receptionist, night clerk at a pharmacy, seasonal packer in a warehouse that mailed Christmas ornaments all over the country. She was not a woman who spoke often of hope, but she washed Ada's school shirts by hand when the laundromat machines downstairs were full, and she pressed them beneath a stack of library books so the collars would lie flat. Elaine had a way of keeping tenderness hidden inside labor. She cut bruises from apples before putting slices into Ada's lunch. She warmed socks on the radiator. She saved blue rubber bands from asparagus bundles because Ada liked using them to hold pencil groups together. On Ada's birthdays, when there was no cake, she put a candle in a biscuit and sang quietly, as though joy were something that had to be protected from hearing itself. Ada never knew her father in any useful way. There were 2 photographs, both bent, both kept behind the plastic window of Elaine's wallet. One showed a young man in a work shirt standing beside a loading dock, squinting into sun. The other showed only his hand on Elaine's shoulder at a picnic table somewhere green. Elaine never lied about him. She simply said he had gone west before Ada could remember his voice, and that some people left because staying required a steadiness they had never been taught. The true fathering in Ada's life came from her mother's father, Silas Vale. He lived outside Columbia, not far from the river, in a narrow brick row house with grapevines along the back fence and a basement workroom that smelled of beeswax, lampblack, metal filings, and old paper. Silas had spent 35 years engraving seals for law offices, county clerks, small banks, funeral homes, insurance men, and families who still believed a letter should close with weight and intention. Every Saturday, when Elaine could spare the bus fare, Ada rode with her to Silas's house. Her mother would drink weak coffee upstairs while Silas took Ada below into the amber light of 2 shaded lamps. There, on a bench scarred by half a century of careful work, he kept his tools in a green felt roll: gravers, burnishers, a square-edged scraper, a narrow hand vise, and one burin so fine he called it the 1/2 mm angel. The first rule, he told her, was not speed. The second rule was not beauty. The third rule was not even accuracy. The hand must learn to wait before it is allowed to cut. He said it once while placing a copper blank into her palm, and Ada remembered the weight of it more than the words at first. The blank was no larger than a nickel, but it carried a solemn coldness, as if it had been sleeping in the earth and had not yet decided whether she was trustworthy. Silas closed her fingers over it and waited until she opened them again on her own. He taught her that wax seal engraving was backward work. A flower leaning left in the finished impression had to be cut leaning right in the die. A letter had to be imagined reversed, not as a trick but as obedience. You did not carve what you wanted to see. You carved what would allow the truth to appear later, under heat and pressure. On some Saturdays he softened grey clay in a saucer and let her press practice seals into it. On others he shaved flakes of rosin into a double boiler and let the room gather the green scent of pine. He measured with an old kitchen scale, 60 parts rosin, 30 parts beeswax, 10 parts pigment, though he would adjust for summer damp or winter dryness with a frown no larger than a comma. Ada loved the moment when dull pieces became liquid. The rosin surrendered first, then the wax leaned into it, then the pigment moved in slow clouds until the mixture deepened to garnet, umber, or a blue so dark it looked almost black. Silas stirred with a thin walnut stick and never hurried the cooling. Bad wax, he said, cracked, because someone had tried to make it become itself too quickly. His unforgettable lesson came one damp April afternoon when Ada, 12 years old and impatient with a crooked vine border, pushed the burin too hard and tore a bright wound across the copper. She expected scolding. Silas took the piece, held it under the lamp, and studied the damage with the gravity of a doctor. Then he said, "A mistake is only ruin if you stop listening." He showed her how the torn line could become a branch, how the branch could hold a leaf, how the leaf could make the original border seem too plain to have been intended. He was not praising carelessness. He was teaching attention. Ada understood years later that he was speaking about more than copper. When Silas died, the basement workroom was locked for 2 weeks because Elaine could not bear the stairs. Ada was 16, the funeral home smelled of carnations and carpet cleaner, and the minister called him a craftsman, which was true but not enough. Craftsman did not contain the sound of his thumbnail testing the edge of a graver. It did not contain the way he warmed copper in his hands before giving it to a child. After the funeral, the house had to be emptied. There were debts Ada had never heard named. A cousin from Harrisburg arrived with boxes and a restless manner. A dealer from Reading came for the tools, the bench vise, the small trays of blanks, the brass lamp, the maple cabinet filled with uncut dies. Elaine stood in the basement doorway with both hands in her coat pockets while strangers lifted Silas's life into cardboard. Ada kept only what she could hide: one dull graver with a cracked pearwood handle, 3 failed copper practice rounds, a clay test disc showing half of a tulip and the reversed letter V. She wrapped them in a sock and placed them beneath the loose lining of her school backpack. The green felt roll went away in a dealer's van. So did the half-millimeter angel. After that, the Saturdays became ordinary: laundry, work shifts, grocery lists, winter drafts. Ada graduated from high school with good marks and no ceremony, beyond Elaine taking her to a diner and ordering 2 pieces of coconut cream pie. She wanted art school, then trade school, then anything with a bench and tools and work precise enough to keep the mind from breaking apart. But illness entered their apartment without knocking, and every plan had to make room for it. Elaine began losing weight in a manner too quiet to alarm anyone at first. Her wrists showed sharply under her sleeves. She sat down while brushing her teeth. She wrote reminders on envelopes and forgot the envelopes. There were appointments, then scans, then a folder with a hospital logo, then medications lined up beside the sink like a row of small white doors. The landlord at that time was Warren Pike, though Ada never called him anything but Mr. Pike. He owned the building above the laundromat, 3 narrow houses behind it, and a storage garage where he kept ladders, broken storm doors, and the kind of tools that looked as if they had been bought for display rather than work. He wore polished shoes even in snow, and he carried keys on a brass ring that clicked softly against his belt when he climbed the stairs. He was not loud, that made him harder to measure. His anger came as paperwork, as silence, as notices slid under a door at dawn. He had a face that seemed permanently arranged around disappointment in other people. When Elaine was late with rent during the second round of treatments, he did not threaten. He stood in the hall with his clipboard held against his chest and said policy required consistency. Elaine apologized to him more than Ada could bear. By then, Ada was working mornings at a print shop, afternoons shelving books at the public library, and nights cleaning exam rooms in a clinic where the smell of disinfectant stayed in her hair. She slept in pieces, she drew less. The tin of pencils remained on her dresser, gathering dust along its lid, waiting like a little coffin for the part of her life that still knew how to begin. Her mother died on a Tuesday before sunrise. The hospital room had a window facing a parking garage, and the first light came in grey, not gold. Ada held Elaine's hand after the hand had stopped returning pressure. A nurse folded the sheet with grave tenderness. Someone brought a plastic bag containing Elaine's sweater, wallet, and a hair clip shaped like a brown shell. There are losses that enter loudly, and there are losses that remove the sound from everything around them. Ada went home that afternoon with a paper bag of belongings and an envelope from the hospital. She placed both on the kitchen table. The apartment looked almost indecent in its sameness. Mug in the sink, blanket over the chair, Elaine's reading glasses on the windowsill. The next morning, Mr. Pike changed the lock. Ada came back from the funeral office carrying her mother's death certificate in a blue folder, the shell hair clip in her coat pocket, and a small cardboard box from the hospital pressed against her ribs. At the top of the stairs, 2 workers were carrying her mattress down the hall. A black trash bag leaned against the wall, split at the side, showing the sleeve of Elaine's green cardigan and one of Ada's winter boots. Mr. Pike stood beside the open door with his brass keyring in his hand. "What are you doing?" Ada said, though her voice came out as air. He did not look cruel. That was the worst of it. He looked prepared. "Lease ended with your guarantor. Effective this morning." 8 words. Exact, cold, and finished. Behind him, the apartment had already become a room belonging to no one. Drawers were open, the dresser mirror lay face down on the bed frame. Elaine's recipe cards were scattered near the trash bag, and a worker stepped over them without looking. Ada pushed past Mr. Pike, not violently, only with the panic of someone trying to reach the last visible shore. "My mother's letter," she said. "There was a letter on the nightstand." The letter had been there the night before the hospital called, sealed in a plain envelope with Ada's name written in Elaine's careful hand. Elaine had told her not to open it until they were home again. They never came home together. Mr. Pike glanced at the room. Anything left after termination goes to disposal. Ada went to the nightstand. It was empty. She opened the drawer so hard it came off its wooden runner and struck the floor. Dust. A button. A folded pharmacy receipt. Nothing more. She searched beneath the bed frame, inside the trash bag, under the limp green cardigan. The workers paused only long enough to let her move around them. Her mother had prepared a final kindness, and the world had treated it as debris. Ada left with the dented tin of drawing pencils, the cracked-handled graver, the 3 copper rounds, the clay disc, 2 changes of clothes, and $5 from the lining of Elaine's wallet that the hospital had returned. She did not shout on the stairs. She did not plead in the hall. She walked past the laundromat windows while dryers turned behind the glass, carrying everyone else's clean sheets in circles. The first night she slept in the York bus station with her backpack looped twice around her wrist. The metal bench had ridges that pressed into her shoulder. A vending machine hummed under fluorescent light. At 3 in the morning, a man in a security jacket told her she could not lie down, so she sat upright until dawn and watched the floor polisher move across the tile like a patient animal. By the end of the first week, she had spent $1.89 on crackers, $1 on a bus ride to Harrisburg because the shelter list there was longer, and 75 cents on hot water from a diner where a waitress pretended not to notice that Ada had brought her own tea bag. The $5 became $3.36, then $2.11. In Harrisburg, she slept 2 nights in the women's shelter near Cameron Street, 1 night beneath the covered entrance of a closed insurance office, and 1 night sitting upright in the Amtrak station until a janitor with silver hair touched the back of a chair near her and said very softly that the police came through at 5. He did not say leave now. He said it in time for her to leave with dignity. She walked west once, then east again, because direction mattered less than warmth. In Middletown, she washed her face in a library restroom and dried it with the sleeve of her coat because the paper towel dispenser was empty. In Elizabethtown, she spent 39 cents on a bruised banana and ate it behind a church hall while choir practice rose through the wall in careful harmony. There were rules to being without a door. Never take off both shoes unless you're certain no one will make you move. Keep one sock dry. Hide money in more than one place. Accept coffee only if you can see the cup filled. Sit where older women sit, because men looking for weakness tend to avoid witnesses with knitting bags and church bulletins. Ada learned the hours of public buildings. Libraries opened like Mercy at 9 or 10. Grocery stores tolerated wandering until a manager noticed the same coat, passing the same aisle. Hospital waiting rooms were warm but watched. Churches varied. Some had red doors and locked hearts. Some had ordinary brown doors and someone inside willing to say there is soup left. She did not call Mr. Pike. She did not go back. The apartment had become a sealed room in her mind, and inside it remained the letter with her name on it, not burned, not found, not read, only taken into the great careless machinery that swallows what poor people cannot defend. 6 weeks passed in weather that could not decide whether winter had ended. Rain hardened into sleet at dusk. Wind moved along the Susquehanna with the flat hand of something tired and enormous. Ada's backpack grew lighter because there was less inside it, yet it seemed heavier each morning. The pencil tin developed a small dent in one corner from being used as a pillow beneath her folded coat. One evening in the Lancaster Public Library, she found the classified ad. It was not in a newspaper at first. It was on a community bulletin board near the stairwell, half covered by a flyer for piano lessons and a notice about a lost orange cat. The paper had curled at the corners. Someone had printed it from the county surplus website and underlined the price in blue ink, perhaps as a joke. County tax repository disposition. Non-conforming commercial structure. Former hand seal and stationery workshop. East Lampeter Township, Lancaster County. Minimum bid $5. Buick assumes all repair, tax, title, and safety NO occupancy certificate. Demolition schedule pending spring review. Below that was a parcel number, a road name, and a small photograph taken in flat daylight. The building in the photograph leaned at the edge of a field beyond a row of walnut trees. Its sign was almost unreadable, but Ada could make out the ghost of painted letters. Val Dort Seals. She stood so still that the stairwell door opened behind her and brushed her backpack. A woman carrying cookbooks apologized. Ada moved aside, then returned to the paper. Her surname was not rare enough to prove anything and not common enough to ignore. Vale on a weathered sign, on a workshop that had once made seals. The library heat clicked through the wall vent. Somewhere upstairs, a child laughed and was hushed. Ada read the notice again, slower, as if it might change under attention. Former hand seal and stationery workshop. Minimum bid $5. Buyer assumes all liability. $5 was not a price. It was a warning. She went to a computer terminal and entered the parcel number with fingers stiff from cold. The county page loaded in fragments. There were photographs from inspections, each worse than the last. Rear roof damage, masonry concerns, no plumbing, unknown electrical condition, recommended demolition due to abandonment. The final line on the page said all bids must be delivered in person to the county clerk's office before noon on Friday. It was Wednesday. Ada took the $5 bill from inside her left shoe in the restroom stall. It had softened from weeks of being carried against her sock. The ink looked tired. She laid it flat against the metal toilet paper dispenser and smoothed it with her palm. For the first time since the lock changed, she allowed herself to handle money not as food, not as bus fare, not as one more day's delay, but as a key. That night she slept behind the library, beneath a covered service entrance that smelled of wet cardboard and stone. She did not sleep much. She listened to rain strike the alley pavement and pictured Silas's hands turning a copper blank under lamplight. She pictured Elaine pressing collars under books. She pictured a crooked sign beyond walnut trees, bearing a name that might mean nothing and might mean everything. By morning, she had decided, she would not buy a rescue. She was not foolish enough to call it that. She would buy a legal place to stand, even if the roof leaked, even if the county expected it to fall, even if she had to sleep on a floor with her coat for a blanket and the wind for company. A condemned workshop was still a door. A door was more than she had been given. At dawn on Friday, Ada washed in the library restroom before the staff arrived by using water from the outside spigot and a paper napkin saved from the day before. She combed her hair with her fingers. She placed the drawing pencils in her backpack, wrapped the cracked graver inside a sock, and tucked the $5 bill into the front pocket of her coat. Then she began walking toward the county building, not because she believed the world had become kind, but because somewhere east of town, behind walnut trees and a failing roof, a forgotten room had kept its silence long enough. And silence, Ada knew, was sometimes the shape waiting took before it opened. The bus let Ada off beneath a sky the colour of pewter, 2 miles short of where the county map said the road should bend. There had been a transfer in Columbia, then a second bus with a cracked front window and 3 passengers who rode without speaking. A man in a feed cap slept with his chin tucked into his chest. An elderly woman held a paper sack in both arms as if it contained something breakable. Ada sat in the rear with her backpack between her feet and the stamped deed envelope resting flat against her ribs inside her coat. The driver had not known the workshop. He knew the township, the school, the turkey farm, and the stretch of road where fog collected in the hollows, but when Ada gave him the parcel number and the name from the notice, he looked at her through the mirror. Nothing out that way but fields. That is all right, she said. He dropped her near a crossroads where a closed farm stand leaned behind a fence, its painted strawberries fading beneath winter grime. The bus sighed, folded its door and pulled away toward Lancaster, leaving a wide silence behind it. The road shoulder was soft with thawing mud. Corn stubble stood in the fields like broken comb teeth, each cut stalk catching a bead of water left by the morning rain. Ada walked east. The temperature had been 34 degrees at the station clock when she left town by mid-afternoon. With the wind moving across open ground, it felt colder. Her coat was thin at the elbows. Her right sock had stayed damp since morning. She had eaten half a biscuit given to her by a woman at the shelter before dawn, saving the other half in a napkin tucked into her pocket. Hunger had become less a pain than a steady instruction, telling her where her body ended. Traffic passed rarely. A delivery van, a truck carrying stacked pallets, a sedan with a child's face pressed pale against the rear window. Each vehicle lifted a cold breath from the road and set it down again behind her. She kept to the gravel, counting utility poles when the miles would not reveal themselves any other way. By dusk she had not reached the property. The county clerk's directions had sounded plain under fluorescent light. Follow Old Philadelphia Pike east, turn where the stone church sits back from the road, keep the creek on your left, pass 2 walnut rows, then watch for the broken sign. But roads in an office are obedient. Roads under winter sky are not. A lane she thought was public ended at a rusted gate. Another bent toward a dairy barn and vanished in ruts. The creek crossed beneath the road once, then disappeared under brush, then returned where she did not expect it. The light thinned, black branches wrote themselves against the fields. When she found the hay barn, she did not enter it quickly. She stood outside and listened. No engine, no voices, no dog. The structure belonged to some larger farm set back beyond a ridge, but this outbuilding had been left for rolled hay and old equipment. One door stood open at the bottom where the boards had warped inside. The air was dry enough to feel like mercy. It smelled of dust, mice, sun stored from another season, and the mineral coldness of iron. Ada climbed into the loft by a ladder polished smooth at the centre of each rung. She did not take off her shoes. She pushed 2 bales together, placed her backpack behind her shoulders, and ate the remaining half biscuit in pieces small enough to last. At midnight, the temperature fell to 28 degrees. She knew because she found an old thermometer nailed to a post above the ladder, its red line sitting just below 30. Moonlight entered through gaps in the siding, striping the hay and the backs of her hands. Somewhere below, a mouse moved with careful feet. She slept and woke, each time returning from dreams of doors closing softly and keys turning. Before dawn, frost had silvered the fields. She climbed down stiffly, brushed hay from her coat, and continued walking with the deed envelope kept close under one arm as if paper could generate heat. By the time the sun rose behind low clouds, she had found the church from the directions, a square stone building with a cemetery beside it, and a bell tower capped in dull slate. The road bent there. The clerk had been exact. Lancaster County revealed itself slowly, not as postcard country, but as working country. Manure-darkened fields where spring planting would come later. Mailboxes leaned at the ends of lanes. White houses stood with green shutters and clipped hedges. Their porches swept even in winter. In one yard, sheets hung on a line and moved in the wind like surrendered flags. The town centre, when Ada reached it near mid-morning, was not large enough to hide inside. It had a hardware store with a striped awning, a cafe called the Copper Kettle, a used bookstore with sun-faded mysteries in the window, a feed and seed shop with sacks of lime stacked by the door, and a barber pole that turned though the chair inside was empty. There was also a bank with brick steps worn shallow in the centre, a pharmacy with a bell over the door, and a post office where two men in work jackets leaned against the wall discussing the price of heating oil. She was aware of herself as she passed the plate glass, wind-burned face, hair combed by fingers, coat dark at the cuffs, backpack with one strap repaired by a shoelace. People did not stare openly, which was almost kinder and almost worse. They looked once, then looked away, and the looking away had its own form of judgment, not cruel human. A woman sweeping the cafe threshold paused and said, "Morning," Ada answered. "Morning, ma'am." The word came out older than she was. The county clerk's office sat in a low brick annex behind the township building. Not grand, not forbidding, simply official in the way of places where paper had authority over weather. The front walk had been salted. A brass handrail ran beside 3 concrete steps. Inside the floor was linoleum made to resemble stone, worn pale along the route from door to counter. The air smelled of copier heat, dust, damp wool coats, and coffee that had been sitting too long on a warming plate. Ada removed her hat, though no one had asked her to. Behind the counter, 2 women worked at separate desks. One was younger, with a headset and a bright cardigan, speaking into a phone about permit copies. The other sat beneath a wall clock that ticked with stern patience. Her hair was white, cut at the chin, and held away from her face by 2 black combs. She wore rimless glasses on a chain and a navy sweater buttoned to the throat. Her nameplate read MRS, Helen a First, County Clerk. Mrs. First looked up before Ada reached the counter, as if she had heard the uncertainty in her footsteps. "May I help you?" It was not quite a question. It was a door set carefully ajar. Ada placed the printed notice on the counter, smoothing the curled corner with 2 fingers. "I came about the repository property." Mrs. First put on her glasses. She read the notice, then looked at Ada over the top of them. Her gaze moved to the backpack, the coat, the hands, not unkindly, thoroughly. "You are here to ask about it," she said. "I am here to buy it." The younger woman at the other desk stopped typing for 1 beat, then began again. Mrs. First leaned back in her chair. The old springs gave a short complaint. She did not laugh. That was the first kindness the office gave. "Do you have identification?" Ada took out her state ID. It had been bent at one corner but was legible. Mrs. First carried it to a copier, placed it on the glass, lowered the lid, and stood there while light moved beneath the cover. She returned with the ID, a copy, and a folder the colour of old cream. "You understand," she said, "this is not a residential sale." "Yes, ma'am." "You understand the structure has no occupancy certificate?" "Yes, ma'am." "You understand there is no active water service, no sewer connection, and no warranted electrical service?" "Yes, ma'am." "You understand the county has made no representation that the building is safe to enter?" "Yes, ma'am." "You understand that any injury, repair, lien, tax burden, pest condition, structural failure, or demolition order becomes yours upon transfer?" Ada kept her hands flat on the counter so they would not close into fists around nothing. "Yes, ma'am." Mrs. First watched her for a long moment. The clock moved 1 second, then another. Somewhere in the back room, a printer began drawing paper through its teeth. "You have walked here," Mrs. First said. "Yes, ma'am." "From where?" "Lancaster." "This morning." "Some yesterday." Mrs. First lowered her eyes to the folder. The younger clerk's typing slowed again. "There is a reason the price is $5. "I know." "No," Mrs. First said, not sharply but with exactness. "You know it costs $5. That is different from knowing why." Ada looked past her to the wall, where a framed map of the county hung behind slightly wavy glass. Townships were marked in faded colors. Roads ran like veins. The place she had come for was too small to name. "I do not have enough to buy anything that is safe," Ada said. "I have enough to buy something that is mine." Mrs. First's mouth tightened, though not with disapproval. She opened the cream folder and removed a stack of forms clipped together at the top. Her hands were square, with short nails and a wedding ring worn thin at the lower edge. She turned the forms one by one, marking signature lines with yellow slips. "Then we will be honest with each other," she said. "Honest is better than cheerful in transactions like this." She read each page aloud in a steady voice. Parcel description, transfer of liability, abandonment status, tax repository disposition, notice of demolition recommendation, buyer acknowledgement of non-conforming commercial structure. Ada signed where she was told. Her signature looked younger each time she wrote it, as if the forms were taking years from her hand. When the moment came, Mrs. First held out her palm. Ada reached into her coat pocket and removed the $5 bill. It had travelled in a shoe, a pocket, a library restroom, a hay barn, and now an office where everything smelled of ink and law. Mrs. First accepted it without comment. She did not flatten it with distaste. She placed it in a receipt drawer, wrote a number in blue pen, and stamped the receipt with a brass-handled county seal. The sound of the stamp landing on paper moved through Ada like a door closing and opening at once. Mrs. First took another instrument from a wooden holder, an older brass stamp with a blackened handle worn smooth by decades of palms. She pressed it into an ink pad, then onto the deed transfer page. The impression appeared slowly. Lancaster County, Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, Recorder's Certification. The circle was imperfect at one edge, softened by age, but it held. Ada could not help looking at it. Mrs. First noticed. "You know seals." "A little." "A little," the clerk repeated, as if placing the phrase on a scale. "My grandfather engraved them," Ada said before caution could stop her. "For offices, mostly legal." "What was his name?" "Silas Vale." The room changed without moving. Mrs. First did not speak at once. Her hand remained on the brass stamp. The younger clerk lifted her head fully now, then lowered it again when Mrs. First gave no permission for curiosity. "Silas Vale from Columbia." "Yes, ma'am." Mrs. First removed her glasses. The chain swung once and settled. "My father had a seal made by him in 1962 for his notary commission. He kept it in a velvet box in the top drawer of his roll-top desk." Ada's throat tightened around the air, so she said nothing. "He said Mr. Vale asked 3 questions before he would cut a seal." Mrs. First looked at the stamped deed. "What must it say? Who must trust it? What should it never pretend?" Ada knew the sentence. Silas had used it with bankers, attorneys, and once with a funeral director who wanted lilies around his initials because his wife had loved them. She heard his voice so clearly that for a moment the clerk's office dissolved into basement lamplight and the scent of rosin. "He was my mother's father," Ada said. "I gathered." Mrs. First stood slowly and went to a filing cabinet behind her desk. She opened the second drawer, searched through hanging folders, and withdrew a thin envelope. From it she took a photocopy of an old tax card, yellowed even in reproduction. She placed it before Ada. There, typed in uneven letters, was the earlier owner history of the workshop. The first lines were partial, names abbreviated by some long-dead clerk, but one entry stood clear enough. Vale Daughter Seal Works. Commercial Hand Engraving. Inactive 1933. Structure retained. No operating permit. Ada put one hand on the counter. Mrs. First did not touch her. She had the discipline of someone who understood that not every trembling hand wants to be held. "Your family, possibly," she said. "Possibly not. Lancaster County has more old names than answers. But I thought you should see it before you walk out there. Why was it not in the notice?" Repository notices are not written by poets. That might have been humour, though. Her face remained composed. Mrs. First returned the copy to its envelope, then reconsidered and made another at the copier. The machine light passed over the card like a second sunrise. She handed the duplicate to Ada along with the deed envelope, the receipt, and a folded map marked in pencil. "Old Philadelphia Pike," she said. "You passed the stone church if you came the long way. From here, take Horseshoe Road north for 3/10, then Lampeter Road east. Do not cut through the Stoltzfus pasture, even if the map suggests it. Their bull is elderly but opinionated. When you see the walnut row, count 12 trees. The lane is after the 12th, almost hidden." Ada nodded, folding the map with care. "Do you have someone meeting you?" "No, ma'am." "A vehicle?" "No, ma'am." "Tools?" Ada touched the backpack strap. "One." Mrs. First inhaled through her nose, not as a sigh exactly, but as a woman choosing which truths to leave unsaid. "There is a hardware store on King Street," she said, "Mellinger's. Tell Mr. Amos Reed that Helen First said you bought the Vale place. Do not let him sell you a generator before he sells you a roof tarp." "Yes, ma'am." "And do not sleep under a damaged chimney." Ada looked up. The clerk's expression had become firmer, almost severe. "I am not asking." "No, ma'am." Mrs. First placed the $5 receipt on top of the deed envelope and pressed it once with her palm, aligning the edges. Then she slid the papers across the counter. "Miss Vale," she said, "a deed is not shelter by itself. I know. But sometimes it is the first legal form of mercy a county knows how to offer." Ada took the envelope. Outside the clouds had thinned but not cleared. The light was pale, coming through as if from behind cloth. She stood on the steps of the clerk's office with the deed tucked beneath her coat and the copied tax card folded into the back pocket of her jeans. People went in and out around her carrying permit applications, dog licenses, envelopes with checks. The world continued its errands. She turned toward the road. The walk from the county office to the workshop took longer than the pencil marks on Mrs. First's map had promised. Horseshoe Road ran past a line of modest houses, then widened into open land broken by barns, equipment sheds, and winter fields resting under last year's stalks. A truck slowed as it passed her, then continued at a mailbox, shaped like a miniature red barn. A brown dog came to the edge of its yard and barked 3 times with professional seriousness. When Ada stopped, it stopped too, tail raised, uncertain whether she was threat, guest, or weather. "Good morning," she told it. The dog considered this and returned to the porch. At the first walnut row, she counted 2 quickly and had to begin again. The trees were black-limbed, high, and spare against the washed sky. Their fallen husks had stained the ground in dark circles beneath the leaves. 12. After the 12th, the lane appeared less as an entrance than as a hesitation in the brush. Gravel lay beneath grass. A rusted chain hung loose between 2 posts, not locked, only suggesting that someone long ago had wanted things to pause before entering. Beyond the lane stood the workshop. It was smaller than fear had made it, and larger than hope could afford. The building sat slightly back from the road, 1.5 stories, perhaps 24 feet wide and 36 feet deep, built of red brick darkened by age and patched in places with fieldstone near the foundation. The roof was standing seam metal, once painted black, now weathered to grey with rust blooming along the rear seam. 1 brick chimney rose from the left side, leaning by a fraction no hurried eye would catch. The front had 2 tall windows, both clouded with dust from inside, and a narrow door painted a green so faded it had become almost the colour of dry sage. Above the door hung the sign. Its board was split down the middle, and the paint had lifted in scales, but under lichen and weather Ada could read enough. Vale, daughter. Hand engraved seals. Wax, stationery, commissions. She stood at the edge of the lane with the deed envelope under her arm, and could not make herself move for several breaths. Not because she was certain. Certainty had belonged to people with savings accounts, working furnaces, living mothers. Ada had only paper, cold hands, and a surname written in peeling paint above a condemned door. The yard around the building had gone half wild. Saplings grew against the side wall. Dead grass lay flattened where snow had pressed it earlier in the season. A porcelain insulator hung from the corner on a broken wire, turning faintly in the wind. Near the foundation, a patch of daffodil leaves had begun pushing up, thin green blades against the mud, as if some buried calendar had not received the county's note. She stepped over the fallen chain. The lane made a soft grinding under her shoes. At the door, she found the lock newer than the building, a county padlock looped through a hasp mounted where older hardware had been removed. Mrs. First had given her the key in a small coin envelope with the parcel number written across the front. Ada's fingers were slow from cold, and it took 3 tries before the key entered. The padlock opened with a click too plain for the weight of it. She lifted the hasp. The door resisted. Not from being locked, from swelling, from age, from the long habit of remaining closed. Ada placed her shoulder against it and pushed carefully, listening for the complaint of wood, hinge, frame. The lower edge scraped against the threshold. Dust loosened above her and drifted in a fine grey line. Then the door gave. The smell came first. Cold wood, dry paper, mouse droppings, old wax, brick dust, metal, a sweetness beneath it all, faint as memory, like honey warmed decades ago and never entirely gone. Ada stood on the threshold until her eyes adjusted. The front room had once been a receiving room, or perhaps a shop. A walnut counter ran along the right wall, its surface dulled but not ruined. Behind it were shallow shelves with labels set into tarnished brass holders. Envelopes, cord, blank cards, pigment. The labels were typed, not handwritten, each word centered with exact care. Against the left wall stood a glass front cabinet, whose panes had gone cloudy, and inside it Ada could see rows of small square boxes arranged by size. The floor was red tile, unbroken except for one cracked corner near the door. Dust lay evenly across it, disturbed only by tiny tracks. A calendar still hung beside the counter, curled into itself at the lower edge. Its picture showed a covered bridge in autumn. The year was 1933. She entered slowly, placing each step where the floor seemed most certain. Light came through the front windows in blurred sheets. The room held its breath around her. On the counter sat an iron scale, a blotter hardened with age, and a ceramic cup containing 3 pencils sharpened to long, careful points. Ada touched nothing at first. Silas had taught her that rooms had order, and order deserved witness before use. She turned in place once, letting her eyes gather what had survived. A doorway without a door led into the back room. There, the building changed from shop to work. The ceiling was lower. One rear corner showed water damage where the opened roof seam had let weather in, but the main bench stood sound beneath the side window. Walnut, thick as an altar, scarred by tools and darkened where hands had rested for years. Above it hung a rack of wooden-handled implements, most missing, some still present. A small vise remained bolted near the left edge. Beside it sat a shallow tray holding copper shavings, so fine they looked like reddish dust. Ada moved closer. Along the far wall stood the stamp cabinet. It was taller than she was, made of walnut like the bench, with narrow drawers stacked in 2 columns and a shallow glass cupboard above them. Each drawer had a brass pull and a label frame. The labels had faded to brown. Some were blank, some bore numbers. One read Court, another read Family. Another, nearly illegible, seemed to say Morning. She did not open them. Not yet. The back room smelled more strongly of wax. Not fresh wax, not usable wax, but the settled ghost of it, held in wood paws, dust and drawer seams. A stove stood in the rear corner, black iron with a round belly, and a pipe rising toward the chimney. Mrs. First had warned her about. Ada did not go near it, she had been told plainly, and plain warnings were a form of care. The rest of the building revealed itself in modest pieces. A narrow stair climbed to a loft too low for standing, where old invoice boxes sat under a sloped ceiling, and daylight showed through 2 nail holes in the roof. A rear lean-to held a dry sink, a cracked pitcher, and shelves where jars had once stood. No plumbing, no electricity that dared be trusted, no bed, no heat. But the windows were present. The floor was mostly whole. The workbench had not been stripped. The stamp cabinet waited with all its little brass pulls in place. Ada returned to the front room before dark. She set her backpack beneath the counter, not behind it, because she had not yet earned that intimacy. From the rear lean-to she found a broom with half its straw missing and swept a rectangle of tile near the inner wall. Dust rose and made her cough. She opened the front door for air, then closed it again when the temperature fell sharply. For supper she had nothing but the memory of food, so she drank water from the bottle she had filled at the clerk's office restroom, and let hunger pass through her without argument. She took off her damp sock and hung it over the counter edge, then put on the dry one from her backpack, and tucked both feet inside her coat as best she could. When night came, the workshop altered. In daylight it had seemed abandoned. In darkness it seemed inhabited by waiting. The walls clicked as cold moved through brick. The roof made small metallic sounds. A branch brushed the side window at intervals, each touch light and deliberate. Ada lay on the swept tile with her backpack for a pillow, the deed envelope inside her coat, the cracked graver held in one hand beneath the blanket of her own arms. She could see almost nothing. The front windows held a faint greyness from the road. Beyond that, the workroom was black, and inside that black stood the cabinet, the bench, the old stove, and the years no one had come to ask what remained. She had slept in stations, shelters, doorways, and one hay barn where frost made lace on the boards. She had slept among strangers under signs, beneath cameras, near vents, and beside locked doors. This floor was colder than some of those places, harder too, but no one could tell her to sit up. No one could say the lease had ended with another person's breath. No one could put her mother's last letter into a trash bag and call it procedure. The building had problems enough to fill a ledger: the roof seam, the chimney, the unknown wiring, the absence of water, the county file thick with warnings. Yet beneath those known troubles, something steady arrested, a counter made by hands that measured twice, a bench that had endured decades of pressure, a sign that had held her name through rain, heat, neglect, and the slow appetite of moss. Near midnight the wind lowered. Ada opened her eyes in the dark and listened. The workshop did not comfort her the way a person might. It made no promises. It did not soften the floor or warm the air or place bread in her hands. It simply remained around her, 4 walls and a roof not whole enough, a door she could lock from the inside, a silence that did not demand explanation. She reached into her coat and touched the deed envelope once, then the small photocopy of the tax card, then the cracked pearwood handle of Silas's graver. After a while her hand relaxed, her breathing slowed. Outside, the walnut trees shifted in the winter dark. The house had been waiting, and now she was waiting with it. On the first morning Ada found the well by following a line of flattened grass behind the lean-to. It stood 20 yards from the rear wall, a low circle of fieldstone capped by a square wooden cover, weighted with 2 bricks. The handle of the pump beside it had rust along its throat, and the spout was green with age, but when she worked it slowly, the pipe answered with a cough from deep underground. At first came air, then a brown spit of water, then a clearer run that struck the tin bucket below, with a sound so plain and useful she almost closed her eyes. She did not drink at once. Silas had taught her that old things were not made trustworthy by wanting them to be. Ada pumped 3 full buckets and poured them into the winter grass. The 4th she carried inside and let settle in a white enamel basin found under the dry sink. Sediment gathered at the bottom like fine tea. She dipped from the top with a chipped mug and boiled it later in a dented kettle. She scrubbed with sand, ash, and patience. The outhouse stood beyond the walnut trees, half hidden behind honeysuckle canes. Its door had no latch, only a leather loop gone stiff with weather inside. The seatboard had split but held. A paper wasp nest, vacant and grey, hung in the upper corner like a failed lantern. Ada cleaned what she could with a stick, a rag, and water carried from the pump. She propped the door open with a stone and let the cold air do what cold air does without complaint. The first 3 days became a study in what would bear weight. She learnt the front room floor was safest near the counter, and least trustworthy where the cracked tile met the left window. She learnt the back room planks answered differently according to hour and temperature. In the morning, the board beside the workbench gave a sharp tick. By evening, after a little sun reached the brick, the same board made a lower note, almost a sigh. The stair to the loft held under her if she kept to the right. The third step complained whether she touched it or not. She marked unsafe places with pencil crosses on scraps of paper and weighed the corners with bits of brick. At night she slept in her coat beneath the counter, where drafts moved over rather than through her. She used the deed envelope as a divider inside her backpack so it would not bend. She kept the cracked graver wrapped in a sock and laid beside her right hand. The workshop remained cold, but cold was at least honest. It did not pretend to be shelter while planning to remove the door. On the second day she swept the front room completely. It took 4 hours because dust had become part of the floor. She moved slowly, broom in short strokes, gathering mouse droppings, flakes of plaster, dead flies, curled leaves, and one tiny bird skeleton light enough to lift on a postcard. She carried the sweepings outside in a broken coal scuttle and emptied them near the brush. The red tile emerged gradually, not clean, not restored, but visible, each square dulled by years and yet unbroken in its place. On the third day, hunger sent her to town before pride could stop her. She took the folded map, locked the workshop, and walked back along the walnut row, past the elderly dog who barked twice, and then recognized her as Weather. In town, Mellinger's Hardware stood between the feed shop and the used bookstore, its front windows crowded with hand tools, seed trays, enamel pans, chimney brushes, mouse traps, lantern wicks, work gloves, storm window clips, and a cardboard sign that read roof cement, tarps, pipe wrap. A brass bell sounded when Ada opened the door. Heat met her first, not generous heat, but steady heat from a stove near the rear, enough to loosen the stiff muscles in her hands. The store smelled of oiled wood, rope, kerosene, onion sets, coffee, machine grease, and the mineral dryness of stacked nails. A narrow aisle ran down the center, with bins on both sides labeled in black marker, 60 common, 8D galvanized, brass screws, cotter pins, hinges, pulley cord. The man behind the counter looked up from sharpening a draw knife. He was large without heaviness, with white hair clipped close to the skull and eyebrows so thick they cast shadows over pale eyes. His hands were nicked, scarred, and clean in the way of a man who washes after work but never loses the record of it. He wore a brown canvas apron over a flannel shirt, and a pencil rested behind one ear. A name patch on the apron said Amos, though no customer would have needed it more than once. "You are the Vale place," he said. Ada stopped halfway inside. "Mrs. First told you." "Helen First tells only what needs telling." His voice had the slow scrape of gravel under a boot, neither warm nor cold. He set the draw knife aside and wiped his hands on the apron. "You need a roof tarp before you need anything else." "Yes, sir." "And you need to not burn that place down trying to get warm." "Yes, sir." "And if you slept in there already, do not tell me." Ada said nothing. Amos Reed looked at her for 3 seconds, then turned and reached beneath the counter. He brought out a spiral-bound manual with a faded yellow cover, Basic Home Repair for Owners of Old Structures. Someone had written 1984 inside the front with a lumberyard stamp below it. "This is not for sale," he said. "It is a loan if you bring it back with all pages attached." "I can do that." "You can read measurements." "Yes, sir." "You can climb." "Yes, sir." "You can stop when something is beyond you." That answer took longer. "I can learn to." He gave a single nod, as if that was the first honest thing in the room. Ada placed the receipt from the county on the counter. "I do not have money today. I can work, sweep, carry, inventory, anything." "You have no money at all." She opened her palm. In it lay 41 cents. 1 quarter, 1 dime, 1 nickel, 1 penny dark with age. Amos studied the coins. Then he studied her. "My father kept accounts on slate," he said. "Said paper made debt look too clean." He pulled a green ledger from beneath the counter, opened to a blank line and wrote Ada Vale Workshop Road in block letters. Under charge limit he wrote $18. Then he drew a line beneath it so straight it seemed ruled, though he had used no ruler. "This is not charity," he said. "No, sir." "It is credit." "Yes, sir." "Credit means I expect payment." "Yes, sir." "Payment can be money. It can be work if work is done clean." "Yes, sir." "You miss a promise." I close the book. "Yes, sir." He looked almost satisfied. "Good. We understand each other." He made a list with the pencil from behind his ear, speaking each item aloud as if she were an apprentice sent for supplies by someone stern. 1 canvas tarp, 12 by 16, used but tight, $4, 50 feet of hemp rope, $1.20, roofing nails, galvanized 1 pound scoop, 65 cents, 1 cold chisel used, 75, 1 stiff wire brush, 40, stove polish can, half full 20, box of kitchen matches, 12, lamp wick, number 2, 6 inches, 10, kerosene, 1 quart, 30, 2 cakes, lye soap from the damaged bin, 8 cents each, 1 chimney brush, 6-inch round, you do not own it, you borrow it, if it comes back bent, you bought it for $3. Ada repeated the totals under her breath and watched him write each in the ledger. The account came to $8.88, more than she had possessed since the morning of the eviction, less than a roof could cost, a mountain and a mercy. Amos added one more item without speaking, a packet of oatmeal in brown paper. Ada saw it and lifted her eyes. "Damaged bag," he said. "Mice got the corner, store cannot sell it." The packet had no mouse damage. Both of them looked away at the same time. Before she left, he pointed to the manual. "Read the chimney chapter before you touch the stove. Then read it again, because the first time you will read like a cold person. Cold people miss warnings." "Yes, sir." "And if the flue is blocked, you do not clear it from below like a fool. You go from the top if the roof will hold, and if the roof will not hold, you do not have a fire." Ada gathered the tarp, rope, nails, brush, soap, matches, wick, kerosene, cold chisel, oatmeal, and the borrowed chimney brush into a burlap sack. Amos gave her from behind the counter. It was too heavy, and he noticed, "Leave the kerosene. Come back for it. I can carry it." That was not a question. She left it. The walk back to the workshop took longer with the sack over one shoulder. Twice she stopped to rest against fence posts at the Walnut Row. The brown dog came halfway down the yard, barked once at the tarp, then returned to its porch as if declaring the matter beneath him. By afternoon she had spread the tarp over the rear roof seam as far as she could reach from the loft window and the lean-to roof. It was not proper, it was not enough, but rope tied to window hinges, a rear post, and one stubborn walnut sapling drew the canvas tight over the worst opening. Rain would still find a way, rain always did, but less of it would enter with full permission. That evening she sat on the front room floor and read the chimney chapter once while her hands shook from weariness. She read it again more slowly after eating oatmeal made with boiled well water, the first warm food she had cooked inside the workshop. The manual was blunt. Inspect the firebox. Confirm flue draft, clear creosote. Check for bird nests, fallen brick, mortar collapse, and blockages. Never assume. Never light a stove into an unknown chimney. On the 4th day she began. She moved the iron stove first, not far, only enough to examine the pipe joint. The stovepipe was rusted but not eaten through. She tapped it gently with the cold chisel handle, listening. Hollow near the top, dull near the elbow. She laid newspaper from the library beneath the joint, loosened the wire collar, and pulled the pipe free with both hands. A rain of black flakes fell onto the paper. Creosote, hard, shiny in places, brittle in others, smelling of old smoke and acid. She wrapped a rag over her mouth. From below, she used the wire brush to clean the first length of pipe, working slowly, rotating rather than scraping wildly. She carried each section outside and tapped it over a flat stone until black scale loosened. The manual had warned that creosote could burn hot enough to crack flue tile and send sparks through unseen gaps. Ada had no wish to be warmed by disaster. The chimney itself took longer. She could not safely stand on the damaged rear roof, but the chimney rose from the left wall, where the metal roof remained sound enough near the ridge. She tested each step before trusting it. Amos's rope went around her waist and through the loft window, not because it would save her from a true fall, but because it might slow a mistake. She carried the borrowed chimney brush tied to a length of rope, with a stone wrapped in cloth as a weight below it. At the chimney crown, she lay flat against the cold metal roof and looked down into darkness. A bird nest blocked the top 2 feet. Twigs, grass, mud, feathers, and what looked like shredded paper packed the opening tight. She removed it by hand at first, fingers numbing, then lowered the brush and worked it in short strokes. Down 6 inches, up 3, rotate down again. Creosote dust rose around her face and settled into her hair. She coughed until her ribs hurt. It took 5 hours the first day. The second day took 4. The third took 2, because by then she understood the flue's shape and the brush moved more cleanly. She worked from top and bottom, clearing the pipe, the thimble, the smoke shelf, and the narrow place where fallen mortar had gathered like gravel. She shone a lamp upward from below at dusk, and saw a pale square of winter sky at the top. That sight was better than bread. She did not light the stove that night. She waited because the manual said to wait. She assembled the pipe again, cleaned the stove belly with the wire brush, emptied the ashpan, checked the door gasket, and polished the draft control until it moved. She set kindling inside but left the matches on the counter. The next morning, after pumping water and washing soot from her hands until the knuckles looked raw, she opened the stove door and built the fire Silas would have approved of, not large, not greedy. A twist of paper, 3 twigs, 2 thumb-thick sticks from deadfall beneath the walnut trees, then nothing more until the draught proved itself. The match struck on the 3rd try. Flame took the paper, then the twigs. Smoke hesitated, entered the room in a thin grey thread, then reversed and pulled upward through the pipe. Ada crouched before the open draught, watching with her whole body. The stove ticked as metal warmed. A darker smell rose, old dust and iron waking. No smoke came from the chimney joint, no sparks fell, no crack sounded from the brick. After 10 minutes, she added 1 split piece of dead branch. After 30, the stove held a modest heart of coals. Ada put the kettle on top and boiled water for oatmeal. She added a pinch of salt. Amos had wrapped in paper without entering it in the ledger. The oatmeal thickened slowly. Steam touched the underside of her chin. She ate from the chipped mug with a wooden spoon found in the dry sink, standing close enough to the stove that one side of her warmed while the other remained cold. It was the first meal in weeks that belonged to a room. After the stove, she began the inventory. She did not open the stamp cabinet first, though it drew her eye every time she crossed the back room. Instead, she began with what lay visible, working from left to right as Silas had taught her. A room speaks most clearly when you do not interrupt. On the workbench sat the iron vise, a stone oil cup, 2 empty tins marked vermilion and lamp-black, a wooden mallet with a split head, 3 broken handles and a brass ruler 12 inches long, engraved with marks so fine she had to tilt it toward light. Beneath the bench were 2 crates, one filled with blank envelopes browned at the edges, the other with paperboard boxes flattened and tied in bundles. The wall rack held 7 tools, a burnisher with an agate tip cracked down the side, a square scraper, a hand drill missing its bit, 2 awls, a pair of dividers, stiff but movable. A long-handled tool Ada could not name until she held it, and recognized the angle as a wax ladle for pouring narrow lines into molds. On the side shelf she found glass jars with labels written in brown ink: rosin, shellac, beeswax, bone black, red ochre, ultramarine. Most contents had hardened, faded, or clumped. One jar of beeswax still smelled faintly alive when she loosened the lid. Its surface had bloomed pale, but beneath the bloom was gold. The loft boxes held invoices, order forms, correspondence, and spoiled stationery. Ada brought down 1 box at a time, never stacking more than she could carry safely. There were letterheads from law firms in Lancaster, Reading, Philadelphia, and Harrisburg, receipts for brass stock, notices from railroad offices, a catalogue from a paper mill. An envelope addressed in copperplate to a Mrs. Theodora Wainwright of Lancaster, never mailed, empty. She sorted by category. Paper, tools, materials, accounts, unknown. The stamp cabinet waited. On the 6th day, with the stove burning low and afternoon light entering through the side window, Ada wiped the cabinet face with a damp rag. Walnut grain emerged beneath dust in slow ribbons. The brass pulls were dark but intact. She cleaned the labels just enough to read without erasing age. The upper glass cupboard held square boxes, each fitted to a die. Some were empty, some held sealing handles without heads, some held clay test impressions wrapped in tissue. She opened the top drawer. It slid out smoothly for the first 3 inches, then caught. She lifted gently and found the runner swollen on one side. Inside were blank copper rounds separated by paper discs, each one tarnished at the rim. Drawer 2 held practice plates. Drawer 3 held damaged seals, their reversed initials cut through or abandoned halfway. Drawer 4 held wax sticks, brittle and pale, arranged by colour: red, black, blue, green, ivory, and a brown almost the shade of dried blood. Drawer 5 was labelled Court. It contained impressions in clay, not dies, each wrapped in tissue and marked with dates from the 1890s through 1928. Ada saw county names, notary seals, probate marks, small official suns and eagles, all reversed in the die work but plain in the clay tests. Drawer 6 was labelled Trade. There were marks for printers, stationers, milliners, carriage makers, a flower company, a seed house, and 2 funeral homes. 1 die remained in its box, H. Brenner and Sons, fine paper. Ada held it only long enough to feel the cold exactness of the engraving, then returned it to its fitted hollow. Drawer 7 was labelled Family. She rested her fingers on the pull. It did not look different at first. Same brass, same walnut face, same narrow label frame. Yet when she opened it, the drawer came out only 8 inches and stopped cleanly, not with a swollen scrape but with a deliberate end. Drawer 6 had been deeper. Drawer 5 had nearly touched the back of the cabinet. Drawer 7 was shorter by several inches. Ada frowned and closed it again. She opened drawer 8. It slid out to full depth. Drawer 9, full. Drawer 10, full. She returned to 7 and removed its contents carefully. 3 empty boxes, a clay impression cracked in half, a paper packet containing tissue scraps, and 1 cedar disc no larger than a silver dollar. The disc had no label, no mark, no evident purpose. It smelled sharply of cedar when she lifted it. She tapped the bottom of drawer 7 with 1 knuckle. The sound was wrong. Not hollow in the theatrical way of treasure stories, not loud, simply higher than it should have been, a thin note under the duller voice of Walnut. She tapped drawer 6, solid drawer 8, solid drawer 7 again. The note returned, careful and concealed. Ada took out the drawer and carried it to the workbench. The weight was wrong too. Empty, it should have been light. It was not heavy, but it held weight at the rear. A settled resistance, as if the wood remembered what it had been asked to keep. She turned it over. The bottom appeared plain. Dovetailed corners, dust in the seams, a small dark knot near the back, no screw heads, no obvious lift. She placed the cedar disc beside it and examined the interior. The back right corner inside the drawer had a darker triangle where dust had not settled evenly. Ada pressed it with her thumb. Nothing. She used the end of the cracked graver handle and pressed again. A click sounded inside the wood. The false bottom lifted by the width of a breath. Ada did not move. The stove gave a low tick behind her. Outside, wind moved through dry grass. Her own hand remained on the graver, steady because everything else in her had gone still. She slid her fingernail beneath the lifted edge and raised the panel. The space beneath was lined with darkened paper. Inside lay 3 packages wrapped in oilcloth, a flat tin box, and a narrow bundle tied with blue thread, so faded it had nearly become grey. Nothing glittered, nothing announced itself. The hidden place smelled of cedar, dust, beeswax and metal kept too long away from air. Ada sat down on the bench stool before touching anything else. The first package was soft. She untied the linen string, folded back the oilcloth, and found a tool roll, not Silas's green felt, but older brown leather cracked at the fold. Inside lay gravers of different widths, each handle shaped by use, each steel point oiled before being hidden. There was a burin fine enough to make her breath catch, narrower even than the one Silas had called the half-millimeter angel. Beside it were a scorper, a lozenge graver, a flat graver, a burnisher, and a tiny whetstone-worn concave at the centre. She touched none of the cutting edges. The second package held raw material: copper blanks, brass blanks, 2 small bars of red sealing wax wrapped in waxed paper, a packet of powdered pigment labelled Carmine Lake, and a folded sheet listing wax ratios in a hand both elegant and severe: rosin, beeswax, pigment, heat slowly, pour at ribbon stage, cool away from draft. The third package was heavier. Inside were boxed dies, 23 of them. Each rested in a fitted square of velvet gone brown with time. Ada opened the first box and found a copper seal face engraved with a monogram so intricate that the letters seemed grown rather than cut. Vines passed through initials. A bird no larger than a grain of rice perched within a curve of metal. Around the border ran a wreath of oak leaves, every vein reversed and deliberate. She opened another, then another. Families, names written on box labels in careful script: Ashbridge, Wainwright, Pemberton, Leacock, Shipman, Biddle, Rittenhouse, Grubb, Coleman, Emlyn. Some she recognized from street names or library histories, some she did not. Each die carried a private mark, not official power, but something more intimate: the closing of letters, the sealing of estate papers, marriage correspondence, condolence notes, promises, refusals, invitations, secrets. A tradesman had held these names in trust. Ada understood that with a certainty deeper than scholarship. No one had left such dies loose in a public drawer. No one had abandoned them by accident. They had been hidden because they were not merely tools, they were confidences cut in reverse and kept from careless hands. The narrow bundle tied with blue thread contained a ledger. Its cover was limp, black, and cracked at the spine. Ada opened it only to the first page. The paper was thin and strong. Names, dates, commissions, payments, notes. Some entries included instructions that sounded almost like prayers. For Mrs. A, no crest, only initials, she dislikes display. For Judge W, mourning border, not too heavy. For Miss E, violet wax. Private correspondence, deliver by hand. Ada closed the ledger. The tin box remained. It was flat, rectangular, and sealed at the edge with a dark line of wax that had split but not fallen away. Ada worked the cold chisel gently beneath the lid. The seal broke with a small dry sound. Inside lay paper wrapped bundles, 3 cloth coin rolls, a folded envelope, and a medal on a faded ribbon. The money had been packed with care. Ada did not count it at the workbench. She cleared the front counter first, wiped it with a damp rag, dried it with her spare shirt, and washed her hands in boiled water gone lukewarm. Then she carried the tin box into the front room, where the last daylight was better, and began laying everything out. There were bills, hundreds, 50s, 20s, 10s, 5s, and older notes, so unfamiliar she had to read them twice. Some were silver certificates, some were Federal Reserve notes from series dates long past. Each bundle had a paper band marked in fountain pen. There were coins, Liberty Head nickels, Barber dimes, Mercury dimes, Standing Liberty quarters, Walking Liberty $half, Indian Head cents, wheat pennies, and 2 Morgan silver dollars wrapped separately in tissue. She counted once, then again, then a third time because hunger and cold could make arithmetic unreliable. The total came to $27,600.37. Ada wrote it on the back of an envelope, then placed the pencil down and sat with both palms on the counter. The amount did not enter her as riches, not at first. It entered as heat might enter frost, slowly with ache before relief. Roof, chimney, food, taxes, glass, time. It was not a castle. It was not escape from labour. It was a bridge made of paper and coin, laid across a place where she had expected only water. Beside the money lay the medal. It was tarnished, suspended from a ribbon whose colours had faded but not vanished. One side bore a winged figure and the words, "The Great War for Civilization." Ada had seen such medals in library books. A World War I victory medal. Along the rim, someone had scratched initials so faint she had to carry it to the window. ELV. 1918. She did not know the initials, not yet. The envelope remained unopened. Her name was not on it. No name was. The paper had darkened to cream, and the flap had been sealed with red wax impressed by a die she had not yet found. The impression showed a hand holding a burin above a flame. Around it ran the words, "What is kept must serve." Ada held the envelope in both hands for a long time. She was not afraid of the money. Money could be counted, divided, hidden again. She was not even afraid of the tools, though their survival pierced her more sharply than she had expected. She was afraid of the letter because letters could speak after the speaker was gone, and Ada had already lost one letter to a trash bag, a clipboard, and a man who called disposal a policy. Evening had come without her noticing. The front room had darkened, the stove in the back settled into coals, the walnut trees outside stood black against a blue-grey sky. Ada placed the envelope back inside the tin box, not because she meant to ignore it, but because the day had given all the life she could hold. She returned the money to its wrappings, the coins to their cloth rolls, the medal to its square of folded paper. She placed the dies back into their boxes one by one, counting them under her breath so none would be misplaced. 23. Then she put everything into the hidden drawer space except the medal and the unopened envelope. Those she carried with her. She locked the front door from the inside, then changed her mind and opened it again. The air outside was colder but cleaner than the room where discoveries had thickened around her. She stepped into the yard and walked past the pump, past the lean-to, toward the creek she had heard but not yet visited. It ran beyond the walnut trees, narrow and quick over stones, swollen by winter rain. Moonlight broke across its surface in small pieces. Ada stood on the bank with the medal in one pocket and the letter in the other. She watched water move around a fallen branch, divide cleanly, and join itself again downstream. She did not read the letter that night. Instead, she listened to the creek until the cold entered her shoes, until the first stars appeared above the fields, until the workshop behind her became not an abandoned building, not a bargain, not even shelter, but a keeper of things entrusted beyond one life's reach. Only then did she go back inside. The house had been waiting, and now she was waiting with it. As morning entered the workshop slowly, first through the high dust on the front windows, then along the red tile in pale rectangles that stopped at the counter. Ada woke before the room had warmed by even a degree. The stove held only ash and a faint iron smell. Her coat was twisted around her knees. For a few moments she did not move, because waking had become a careful inventory. Roof still holding, door still locked, backpack still near, deed still dry, body still here. Then she remembered the envelope. It lay on the counter beside the tarnished medal, exactly where she had placed it before sleep overcame her. The red wax seal had cracked at the edge but remained whole in the center, the impressed mark still legible. A hand, a burin, a small flame. What is kept must serve. Ada washed her hands before touching it. She pumped water until the first rusty cough cleared, boiled it, let it cool in the enamel basin, and rubbed her fingers with lye soap until soot lifted from the lines of her skin. The letter had waited longer than she had been alive. It deserved hands that had tried to be clean. At the counter, under the best light, she studied the writing on the folded outer sheet. It was not Silas's hand. His letters had leaned forward, impatient despite his teachings. This hand stood upright, slender and exact, with long descenders and a firm cross on every T. Yet something in the spacing struck Ada with recognition. The patience between words, the refusal to crowd a line, the sense that each mark had been placed after the hand asked permission of the page. She broke the wax with the cracked pearwood handle of Silas's graver. The paper opened along old creases. Inside was a letter of several pages, written in dark brown ink that had paled at the folds. Ada sat on the stool behind the counter. She placed the medal above the first page like a small weight and began, "My dear one, whoever you are, If this letter has reached your hands, then the shop has outlived my plans, my worry, and perhaps even my name. I am writing in the winter of 1932 with a clear mind and an unsteady body. Dr. Nathaniel Horst of Lancaster examined me last month, and then Dr. Miriam Ashe of Philadelphia confirmed what he did not want to say plainly. The growth in my lungs is not a passing illness. They have given me months, though months are a cloth no physician can measure exactly. My name is Eleanor Lydia Vale. I was born in 1874 in Columbia, Pennsylvania, daughter of Matthias Vale and Ruth Brenner Vale. My father learned seal engraving from his father Gideon Vale, who came down from Bethlehem as a young man after the war between the states, carrying one tool roll, 2 shirts, and a letter of introduction to a printer on King Street. Gideon's father, Abram Wall, before he took the name Vale for easier American tongues, was born near Germantown to people who had come from the Rhine with pewter moulds, hymn books, and hands trained to make useful beauty. My mother's line, the Brenners, kept paper and ink shops along the river, so I was born between mark and page, between what is pressed and what receives. This shop was first called Vale Hand Seals in 1849, when Gideon rented a bench behind a stationer. In 1888, my father added the word daughter to the sign after I cut my first acceptable mourning border, though 3 customers objected to entrusting a family mark to a woman. My father told them they were free to take their secrets to a poorer hand. 2 returned within a week. The 3rd returned after his cousin praised my ivy work. For many years people came here with the private emblems of their houses, offices, griefs, marriages, and ambitions. They trusted us with initials not yet announced, inheritances not yet settled, letters not meant for every eye. A seal is a small door. The engraver must know that a door is sacred because it may be opened. The day that closed the trade was October 23rd, 1931. I remember the date because rain ran under the front door, and because Mr. Caleb Ashbridge came for the last family die we completed in the old manor. He stood where the counter still stands and said his sons would use printed adhesive seals now, ordered by catalogue in quantities of 500. They were cheaper, he said, and uniform. I told him many things in this life are cheaper for not being touched by a human hand. He had the grace to lower his eyes. After that day, no new commission came that required the burin. There were repairs, initials for notaries, 2 funeral seals and 1 wedding set in violet wax for a girl whose mother had ordered from my father. Then silence. More than 30 years of silence had gathered before that final year. Though the shop continued to open its door, the world did not slam shut. It merely stopped knocking. My husband Elias Vernon did not return from France in 1918. The medal enclosed was sent after the armistice, along with a letter too formal to contain the shape of him. My brother Samuel lost a lung to gas at Meuse-Argonne and lived 9 years afterward in a chair by the south window. My only son Peter died in 1926 of fever before he reached 20. Loss does not make a person wise. It only gives wisdom a place to enter if the person will keep the door from rusting closed. I have hidden here what I could not bear to see scattered in estate sale boxes. The money is not a fortune. It is roof money, winter money, tax money, a little breathing money. Do not let it teach you idleness. Let it purchase time enough for honest work to begin again. The dies are not trophies. Return none of them to fashionable hands unless conscience approves. They were made under trust, and trust survives its owners. If you mean to make wax, remember this. Rosin at 60 parts gives the stick spine. Beeswax at 30 gives it kindness. Pigment at 10 gives it voice. Warm the rosin slowly until it loosens and shines, never above 180 degrees if your thermometer can be believed. Add beeswax only after the sharp pine smell has softened. Stir with wood. Metal hurries the heat. Add pigment when the mixture falls from the stick in a ribbon and not in drops. Pour into warmed moulds. Let the sticks cool when no draught crosses them for 40 minutes. Longer in January. A rushed stick will crack along the heart. For copper, anneal gently, not to red unless the piece is stubborn. Let it cool in air. If you want patience in the metal, clay will tell you what the eye forgives. Press every die before calling it done. A reversed letter may shame a careless hand for generations. If you are kin to me, I greet you. If you are not, I greet you no less. Blood is only one road by which inheritance travels. There is also hunger, accident, need, attention, and the strange mercy of arriving at a locked place with a key no one expected you to hold. I have spent much of my life believing that a house does not belong to the one whose name is written at the courthouse, but to the one who keeps faith with what the house was built to protect. If you have come here only for money, take enough not to freeze and leave the rest hidden for one who can listen. If you have come here with a careful hand, a tired heart, or nowhere else to stand, then sit down. There is work to do, but not all of it must be done today. Behind the shop, in the walnut nearest the creek, my father set an iron horseshoe into the bark after the flood of 1889. Beneath that tree we buried the first spoiled dies, not because they were useful, but because mistakes deserve a resting place too. Go there when you need reminding that even flawed work belongs to the story. The house is not empty, it has been waiting. You are welcome here. Eleanor, Lydia Vale, Vale daughter hand engraved seals, December 14th, 1932. Ada read the letter once without stopping. Then she read it again, more slowly, with the stove unlit behind her and the cold moving up through the stool into her legs. On the second reading, small facts separated themselves from the great whole and stood near her like people entering a room one at a time. Eleanor, Lydia Vale, the rain on the last commission day, the sons who preferred printed adhesive seals, the husband in France, the brother by the south window, the son buried before 20, rosin at 60, beeswax at 30, pigment at 10. When she came again to the line about the letter reaching whoever had a careful hand, she placed her own hand flat on the counter, palm down, as if measuring it against the wood. She did not cry in any way that would make a scene of it. Her breath shortened, her jaw tightened once. A drop fell from her face to the page and darkened the paper near the margin, not touching the ink. She moved the letter aside until the mark dried. After a long while, she folded the pages along their original creases. Not new creases, not easier ones. The old lines knew where the paper wished to bend. She returned them to the outer sheet and placed the broken wax flakes in the tin box, because even the broken seal had belonged to the keeping. The workshop seemed altered, though nothing had moved. The counter remained dulled walnut, the front windows remained filmed with dust, the stove remained cold, the stamp cabinet stood in the back room with its seventh drawer closed, plain as any other drawer, yet the silence no longer felt vacant. It had a name inside it now, several names: Eleanor, Matthias, Ruth, Gideon, Abram, Elias, Samuel, Peter, Silas, Elaine. Ada did not arrange them into lineage because the letter had already warned her that blood was only one road. Still, the names stood quietly in the room, patient and exact. She put on her coat and carried the letter with her out the back door. The ground had softened overnight. Mud took the print of her shoes and kept it. Behind the lean-to, past the pump and the outhouse, the land sloped toward the creek, where walnut roots held the bank in a knot of dark fingers. There were several trees near the water, all weathered, all taller than the shop, but one had grown with a slight bend toward the west. On its creek-facing side, half swallowed by bark, was the iron horseshoe. Ada almost missed it. The metal had blackened and sunk into the tree over years, the bark swelling around it like closed skin around a healed wound. Only the curved outer edge remained visible, along with two square nail heads rusted nearly smooth. Moss had gathered along the lower arc. She reached toward it, then stopped before touching, because some objects are not asking to be handled, they are asking to be found. At the base of the tree, beneath wet leaves, the ground was uneven. She knelt and cleared with both hands, not digging deep, only lifting leaf mold, twigs, and soil loosened by rain. There, just below the surface, she found fragments of clay impressions, darkened and broken, and one copper disc cut halfway through with a monogram abandoned after the first wrong turn. The spoiled dies had indeed been buried there, given back to earth under the horseshoe. Ada held the broken copper in her palm. A mistake is only ruin if you stop listening. Silas's voice arrived without warning, not as memory exactly, but as continuation. She closed her fingers around the disc, then returned it to the shallow place beneath the leaves. The ruined work had been resting there long before her grief became the largest thing she knew. It did not need rescuing, it had kept its lesson. Back inside, she searched the upper shelves until she found what the inventory had noted but not valued. A short beeswax candle wrapped in paper so brittle it loosened in flakes. A penciled mark on the wrapping read Christmas window 1872. The wick was dark but intact. It might not burn. It might crumble. It might have been meant for display, not use. Ada set it in a brass holder from the shelf behind the counter. She cleaned the holder with her sleeve until a dull glow appeared, then placed it on the workbench beside Eleanor's letter, the medal, and Silas's cracked graver. The candle stood slightly crooked. 60 years was too small an estimate for it. It had waited through more winters than anyone living had counted from inside that room. She struck a match. For a moment nothing happened. The wick smoked, the flame leaned, thinned, and nearly died. Then the old beeswax accepted fire. A small gold light gathered itself and steadied. It did not brighten the room much. It did not need to. Its work was not illumination alone, but witness. Ada sat before it on the bench stool, hands folded between her knees. She thought of Mrs. First, who had read every warning aloud and still given directions to the Walnut Row. She thought of Amos Reed writing her name into the credit ledger as if she were a person who could return and pay. She thought of the waitress who had charged her for hot water and forgotten to charge for the tea. She thought of the janitor at the station who had warned her before the police came through. She thought of the woman at the shelter who had put half a biscuit in her hand without looking to see whether Ada was ashamed. No one had saved her entirely, perhaps people rarely do, but each had placed one narrow board across water, and she had crossed by using all of them. The candle flame moved when the wind found a gap near the rear seam of the roof. Ada watched it bend and right itself. She understood then, not in words at first, why the letter had not told her to be grateful for suffering, or to turn loss into something polished for strangers. Eleanor had written no sermon of triumph. She had left instructions: warm slowly, stir with wood, let cool away from draught, do not call a thing done until it has been pressed and tested. The lesson was not only for wax. If you are watching this from a warm room tonight, maybe you remember a small kindness that did not look large to anyone else. A clerk who stayed after closing, a neighbour who shoveled your walk before you woke, a nurse who folded a blanket without being asked, a stranger who gave directions, not pity, a teacher who returned your paper with one sentence that helped you keep going. Tell us about it in the comments if you can. Not because every kindness repairs the whole world, it does not. Some losses remain losses, some letters are taken before they can be read, some rooms are emptied by people who never learn what they have touched. But a small mercy given at the right hour can become a hinge. It can let a door move. It can keep a person from believing that every lock has the same owner. That evening Ada made the stove fire carefully, as if Eleanor might be watching the draught from the south window. She boiled water, stirred oatmeal, and added a shaving of old beeswax to a cracked lid, not for eating, but to smell again the sweetness that had lived in the shop's wood. The candle burned beside her while she ate. The flame sank slowly, forming a clear pool around the wick. Before sleep she returned the money to the false bottom drawer. She did not count it again. Counting would become necessary later when roofers, taxes, glass, mortar, and food had to be faced with exact sums. That night, knowing was enough. She laid the 23-box dies beside the wall beneath the counter, wrapped in oilcloth. She placed the tool roll next to her backpack, not hidden but near. The medal she folded inside a clean scrap of cloth and set beside Eleanor's letter. Silas's cracked graver lay across the top of the pages like a bridge between hands that had never met. The workshop darkened around her. Ada slept on the red tile again, still cold, still hungry enough to wake before dawn, but no longer entirely without inheritance. Beside her rested a letter that had crossed more than 90 winters, a medal from a war older than her mother's mother, tools sharp enough to begin again, and the quiet proof that somewhere in the long keeping of the world, a place can remember a person before she has learned how to remember herself. The first snow came on December 3rd, just after midnight, and by morning 6 inches lay across the fields with a patient, levelling hand. Ada woke because the workshop had become too quiet. Snow changes sound before it changes sight. It softened the road, the creak, the loose metal at the roof seam. even the wind moving through the walnut trees. When she opened the front door, cold stepped in hard enough to make her breath visible all the way to the counter. The yard had vanished under white. The lane was only a shallow depression. The workshop sign carried a line of snow along its broken top edge, making the faded letters seem newly written for the span of one morning. She did not work outside that day. Instead, she sat near the stove with the repair manual open across her knees and read the roof chapter 3 times. The first time she read for fear, the second time for sequence, the third time with a pencil in hand, copying terms onto the back of an old invoice: decking, underlayment, flashing drip edge, rafter tail, sister repair, pitch, overlap, cap seam. The manual assumed more money, better weather, and a second pair of hands. Ada made notes where the book could not know her circumstances. The damaged area lay along the rear roof seam, beginning 6 feet from the chimney side and running nearly 11 feet toward the lean-to. The standing seam metal had opened where fasteners failed, and one narrow section of decking beneath had softened from years of water. The rest of the roof, especially the front slope, held better than the county photographs suggested. That did not make it safe. It made it possible. She measured from the loft with a string, a bent ruler, and chalk. The rear slope was 12 feet from ridge to eave. The damaged strip covered roughly 132 square feet, but Amos told her never to buy materials according to Hope. Hope cuts short, he said. Measure waste. At Mellinger's, he made her do the calculation on brown wrapping paper before he would enter materials into the credit ledger. 2 rolls of 15-pound roofing felt at $3.40 each, 1 bundle of 3-tab asphalt shingles weathered grey from last season's stock, $9.75, a half bundle from a torn package, $4, galvanized roofing nails 1 1/4 inch, £2, $1.30, 1 tube roofing cement, dented but sealed, 79 cents, a roll of aluminum flashing, partial, $2 even. Ada added the columns twice. Amos watched without interrupting. When she reached for the pencil a third time, he took it from her hand and drew a line under the total. You are over the account. I know. You have work credit from sweeping the back room and stacking lime. Yes, sir. And from sorting the hinge bins. Yes, sir. He turned the ledger toward himself and wrote slowly, each number pressed hard enough to dent the page below. Do not make me regret clean arithmetic, he said. I won't. From beneath the counter, he brought out a roofing hatchet with a square head, a worn leather grip, and a narrow gauge notch near the blade. He set it down between them with more care than he had given the shingles. My brothers, he said, he roofed barns from here to New Holland before his knees quit. He is gone now. Ada did not reach for it immediately. Amos looked past her toward the front window where snow slid from the awning in soft pieces. It is not a gift. It is a tool on loan until the roof no longer leaks. Yes, sir. And if you drop it from the ridge, climb down before you curse. The next morning, when Ada returned to the workshop with the hatchet wrapped in sacking, a man stood in the lane looking at the roof. He was narrow and bent, with shoulders that had settled downward but not inward. His beard was white and trimmed close. He wore a black wool cap, patched canvas coat, and work boots whose soles had been repaired more than once. A coil of rope hung over one shoulder. He did not turn when Ada approached. You are leaking at the seam, he said. Yes, sir. And at the rear nail line. I thought so. You thought right. He turned then. His eyes were pale blue, almost watery, but the gaze behind them remained exact. Name is Jonah Klein. Ada had heard the name at Mellinger's, former roofer, former everything according to Amos, who said Jonah had worked higher places than most men cared to look down from, and had never once fallen through his own foolishness. Mr. Reed sent you. Reed told me. Sending is different. I cannot pay you. I did not ask. I can work. You will. That was the whole arrangement. For 11 days, weather permitting, and sometimes weather barely permitting, Ada and Jonah worked on the rear roof. He would not climb after frost if the metal showed a shine. He would not allow a ladder to stand on snow. He made her shovel the ground clear, set the feet on boards, tie the ladder twice, and test each rung with weight before using it. He spoke in fragments that contained entire chapters. 3 points. Do not reach. Weight low. Watch the edge. The roof damage was worse where the tarp had sagged. 2 boards beneath the seam had softened to dark fibers. Jonah showed her how to cut out the worst section without enlarging the wound. He made her feel the difference between rotten wood and merely wet wood by pressing the hatchet point in and letting resistance teach her hand. "Sister Rafter here," he said, tapping the exposed side with 2 knuckles. They cut a length of sound 2x6 from lumber Amos had found in a shed behind the hardware store. It was not new, but it was straight. Jonah showed her how to set it alongside the weakened rafter, clamp it tight, and nail through at alternating angles so the old and the added piece carried weight together. "Not pretty," he said. "Strong. Strong enough." The first time Ada drove a roofing nail, she left the head high. Jonah leaned over it. "That nail's proud." She lifted the hatchet again. "Pull it." She pulled it. The second nail bent. "Pull it." She pulled it. By the 3rd morning, her right wrist ached from the grip. By the 4th, she learnt the 3-stroke rhythm, Jonah demanded. Set, drive, seat, not a fury of blows, not timid tapping. The hatchet struck the nail head once to claim position, once to send it, once to finish it flush without cutting the shingle. He made her practice on scrap until the line of nails looked like a sentence written by the same hand. The chalk line came next. Jonah rubbed the cord with blue chalk, stretched it across the felt, and let Ada hold one end while he held the other. Wind moved under their coats, snowmelt dripped from the eave. When he snapped the line, a straight blue mark appeared across the grey, clean as judgment. "Roof follows line," he said, "not mood." They laid roofing felt with 2-inch overlaps, then shingles from the eave upward, each course measured, offset and nailed. Around the chimney side, Jonah showed her how flashing had to guide water away rather than merely cover a gap. "Water reads every lie," he said. "Tell it the truth." Some days they worked only 3 hours before cold closed Ada's fingers. Some days they worked until late light made the metal roof dangerous. Jonah brought no lunch she could see, but on the 6th day he left half a hard-boiled egg on the counter wrapped in wax paper. Ada did not mention it. He did not ask whether she ate it. On December 14th, the rear seam was closed beneath felt, shingles, flashing, and cement. It was not a new roof. It was a held roof. When rain came 2 days later, Ada stood in the loft for nearly an hour and watched the patched line. One drop formed where an old nail hole remained above the lean-to. She marked it, sealed it the following morning, and waited again. By mid-December, the bowls and tins she had placed under leaks stayed dry through a full night of rain. Jonah came the next afternoon, looked once from the lane, and gave a single nod. "That will keep you." Then he walked back toward the road before Ada could make gratitude into something that might burden him. January made the bricks speak. The chimney had survived Ada's cleaning, but survival was not the same as soundness. Once the roof no longer admitted rain at the rear seam, she could hear the chimney more clearly in cold weather, not with ears alone, with the room. When wind pressed from the west, a faint powder sifted onto the hearthstone. When the stove warmed too quickly, the mortar joints gave off a dry smell, like dust rubbed between old fingers. Outside, the bricks near the crown had begun to spall. Their faces had flaked away in thin scales, exposing softer red beneath. In places the mortar could be scraped with a fingernail. Ada climbed only as high as safety allowed, tied the rope around her waist, and used a spoon handle to test the joints. Powder came loose in grey grains. Some of it fell down the roof and vanished into snow. She took a sample to Mellinger's in a folded envelope. Amos spread it on the counter and pressed it with his thumb. "Portland patch over lime," he said. "Is that bad?" "It is common. Common is often bad," he explained without gentleness, which she had come to value. Old brick needed mortar softer than the brick itself. Hard modern cement trapped water, and water freezing and thawing broke the brick face away. The chimney had been patched by someone who wanted a quick surface to look finished. The surface had lied. Winter had read it. For the repair, Amos measured into brown paper sacks, hydraulic lime, fine sand and fireclay. For lower exterior joints, 3 parts sand to 1 part lime. Near the throat and heat-exposed sections, 2 parts fireclay, 1 part lime, 1 part sharp sand, mixed in small batches. No more water than needed. Let it slake, keep it covered. Do not work frozen material. Do not point over dust. You will want to do too much in one day, he said. Yes, sir. That was not advice. That was a warning. For 3 weeks, Ada worked in temperatures that stayed mostly in the 20s. Some mornings the thermometer inside the workshop read 26 degrees before the stove caught. She learned to warm water in a kettle, pour it into a covered pail, and mix mortar indoors near the stove so it would not freeze before reaching the joint. She carried only what she could use in 15 minutes, because after that her hands went numb and the mortar stiffened. The work began with removal. She used the cold chisel and a narrow pointing tool borrowed from Amos. Scraping out failed mortar to a depth twice the joint width, she brushed each joint with a stiff bristle brush, then with a smaller wire brush, then misted the brick with warm water so it would not steal moisture too quickly from the new mix. The first day she tried to hurry and the mortar sagged from the joint in a grey tongue. She scraped it out and began again. Jonah came by once, not to work, he said, only to look. He watched her load the hawk and push mortar into a vertical joint with the pointing trowel. Too wet, he said. Ada held the trowel still. Cut it tighter. She added dry mix and folded it until the mortar held shape when pressed. He gave no praise. He stayed long enough to see 3 joints packed correctly, then left a pair of old wool glove liners on the bench and pretended he had forgotten them. The chimney demanded positions nobody should hold for long, kneeling on frozen ground beside the exterior stack, standing on the lower roof with one hip braced against brick, reaching into the firebox to repair a shallow joint where heat had eaten the old mortar to a sandy hollow. Her shoulders burned, her fingers cracked at the sides. Every 15 minutes she had to stop, tuck bare hands under her arms, and wait for pain to return, because pain meant feeling had not left entirely. She learned the difference between filling and packing. Filling made a joint look whole at the surface. Packing drove mortar deep enough to become part of the wall's memory. She pressed with the edge of the trowel, then with a slicker shape to the joint, compacting until no hollow remained. After the initial set, she brushed the surface lightly so the repair did not stand proud and trap water. At night, she read Eleanor's technical lines by candlelight. Warm slowly, let cool away from draft, press every die before calling it done. The work of chimney mortar was not so different. Nothing wanted haste, everything revealed impatience. By the 3rd week, the rebuilt crown held a slight slope away from the flue. Amos had sold her on credit, and with visible reluctance, a sheet metal rain cap from a discontinued bin. Jonah helped fasten it only after making her explain why spark arresting mattered and where water would run. Water goes down, he said, unless wind drives it sideways. He looked at her. You are learning. The test fire came late in January, after 3 days of curing with no hard freeze inside the flue. Ada built it smaller than the first winter fire. Paper twig. 2 narrow splits. She opened the draft and watched smoke rise. It went clean. Not perfect. The stove still smelled of iron and old ash. The chimney still had age in it, but no smoke rolled into the room. No powder fell. Outside she stood in snow crust and watched a pale ribbon lift from the cap, straight at first, then bending east with the wind. She stayed there until her hands hurt. When she returned inside, the front room held a warmth that did not feel stolen. It had passed through repaired brick, obeyed draft, and left without anger. Ada set the kettle on the stove and listened to it begin its low work. The house had been waiting, and now she was waiting with it. By late January, the floor had become visible enough to ask for care. The red tile in the front room needed cleaning, not replacing, but the back room floor was white pine, worn dark in paths between the bench, stove, cabinet, and rear lean-to. Some planks had cupped, some showed blackened circles where jars or hot tools had once been set down. Near the workbench, a constellation of hand-cut rose head nails caught light after Ada scrubbed away the top layer of grime. each nailhead irregular, each one placed by a person who had not expected machines to make sameness a virtue. The floor did not want to be made new. Ada understood that before the manual told her, new would have been an insult. It wanted to be freed from dirt, splinters, and the grey skin of abandonment. It wanted its wear to be legible. Amos rented her a random orbit sander for $14 a day, though rented was not the word either of them believed. He wrote it into the ledger as floor machine, 1 day, $14, then beneath it, credit work pending. He gave her 3 sleeves of paper, 80 grit, 120 grit, 220 grit. Keep it moving, he said. Yes, sir. Do not dig. No, sir. Edges by hand. Yes, sir. And wear this. He placed a paper dust mask on the counter. The sander was heavier than it looked. Ada carried it back in a borrowed handcart with 1 squeaking wheel, stopping twice between town and the Walnut Row. In the back room, she removed every movable object, stacking tools, boxes, and supplies in the front shop with labels tied to them. She swept, vacuumed with Amos's old hand pump contraption, and set the stove low so the room would stay just warm enough for finish work later. The 80 grit pass began like weather. The machine trembled through her arms and shoulders. It wanted to wander. It wanted to bite where boards had lifted. Ada held it firmly without forcing, guiding it along the grain in slow overlapping paths. Dust rose despite the collection bag, fine and pale, smelling of pine that had waited under darkness for decades. Each pass removed not history, but the film over history. Dark grey became brown, brown became honey. Near the bench, where oil and hands had worked into the grain, the wood deepened rather than lightened. She did not try to erase those places. The 120 grit pass took less wood and more time. It softened the harshness left by the first cut, bringing out lines that moved like quiet water through the boards. The rose head nails had to be avoided or set. She used a nail set and a small hammer, tapping gently until the high head sat just below the surface. 1 plank near the stove had split at the end. She cleaned the crack, worked hide glue into it with a thin shaving, clamped it overnight, then sanded only after the repair held. The 220 grit pass felt almost tender. By then her arms were unsteady. The work had entered her elbows, her back, the place between her shoulder blades. She returned the machine after dark, pulling the handcart under a sky sharp with stars. Amos checked the cord, the pad, the bag, and wrote nothing more in the ledger. Floor tell on you? Yes. What did it say? Slow down. He nodded. Most floors do. The finish took 3 coats. For the first, Ada used thinned tung oil cut with citrus solvent Amos had in a dented can. She applied it with lint-free cloth, working in small sections, letting the oil soak, then wiping away what the wood refused. The floor darkened at once, not evenly, not politely. Honey appeared in the centre planks near the stove, amber. Under the bench, mahogany. By the cabinet where generations of feet had turned and paused, the boards held a deep brown like tea. She waited 48 hours. The second coat was a mixture of tung and linseed oil, rubbed harder, warmed slightly in a jar set near the stove but never made hot. She learned that finish punished greed. Too much oil left a tacky shine, too little failed to feed the dry grain. She moved on her knees with rags folded into squares, changing them before they clogged, hanging used cloths outside over a metal rail, because Amos had warned her about spontaneous combustion until the words sounded like scripture. The third coat went on thinner still. Afterward, the room smelled of oil, pine, iron, and faint beeswax from the sealed jars. Ada barred herself from walking across the boards for 2 days except on strips of cardboard laid from the door to the stove. Waiting became part of the labor. To work on a house was to accept that progress sometimes looked like leaving a room alone. Then came the bad morning. It was the last week of January. The thermometer read 22. The stove smoked at the first match because wind had shifted strangely over the chimney cap. Ada had slept poorly. Her hands hurt before she used them. The ledger at Mellinger's had grown longer than she liked. The roof was held, not solved. The chimney was repaired, not young. The floor gleamed in the back room, and instead of satisfaction she felt only the weight of everything still broken. She put on her coat and walked without tools. past the pump, past the outhouse, past the walnut with the horseshoe. Beyond the creek the land opened toward a marshy hollow where winter reeds stood pale and stiff. Water showed between them in dark seams. Ada sat on a fallen log with her hands inside her sleeves and watched a great blue heron move through the shallows. The bird stepped as if time had never been scarce. One foot lifted, waited, entered water. The long neck bent, held, struck. The heron swallowed something too small for Ada to see, then returned to stillness. It did not apologize for needing the marsh. It did not hurry because cold existed. It did not turn labor into proof of worth. It simply stood where it had to stand and took the morning as given. Ada stayed there until noon. She did not work that day. She did not read the manual, tally costs, scrub soot, sort tools, or test wax. She returned near evening, made oatmeal, warmed her hands, and looked at the floor without asking it to become anything more before morning. The next day, the oil had cured to a low sheen. The boards did not shine like a showroom. They held light like a memory kept clean. February announced itself through glass. There were 8 windows in the workshop, 2 tall ones in the front shop, 1 on each side wall, 2 in the back room, 1 small window in the lean-to, and 1 narrow sash beneath the loft gable. 3 had no glass at all, only boards nailed across the frames. 4 were cracked, their panes held together by dirt, old putty, and the stubbornness of weathered wood. 1 window high on the east side of the back room still held its original wavy glass, marked in the corner by a tiny air bubble trapped like a seed. Amos said that pane might be 18th century glass, though the workshop records would have to prove the exact year. "Do not replace that one," he said. I was not going to. Good, some windows are witnesses. He sold her DAP 33 glazing putty from a can with a skin over the top, which he cut away with his pocket knife. He gave her glazing points in a folded paper packet, a used putty knife, a small box of 1-inch brads, a length of 1/4-inch cotton sash cord, and a warning about ladders repeated so many times it acquired rhythm. He also let her sort old storm window clips in exchange for 6 salvaged panes taken from a farmhouse remodel outside Strasbourg. The glass did not match perfectly. That was a virtue. Perfect glass would have looked like a lie set into an honest face. Ada began with the missing panes. She removed the boards carefully, saving any nail that came out straight. Behind them the frames were damp but not rotten. She scraped old putty from the rabbets, softened stubborn sections with careful heat from a kettle-warmed cloth rather than flame, and brushed away loose paint. The first pane took half a day. Measuring glass frightened her more than roofing had. A roof could overlap. Glass had to enter its place with a margin small enough to hold and large enough to survive seasonal swelling. She measured twice, then once more because Amos had told her glass remembers arrogance. The pane was set on a thin bed of putty, pressed into the rabbet. Ada eased it in with both hands, feeling for the slight cushion beneath. She pressed glazing points into the wood with the putty knife, 1 every 8 inches, each holding the glass without straining it. Then she rolled putty between her palms into a cord and laid it along the edge. The knife angle mattered. 45 degrees, pressure steady, corner clean, excess lifted away and worked back into the can. Her first line was ugly. She scraped it out. The second line held. By the third window, her wrist understood more than her mind could explain. Push, angle, draw, lift. The putty formed a sloped seal that would shed water instead of keeping it. She cleaned the glass with vinegar and newspaper, and light entered in a way that changed the room's grammar. Corners appeared. Dust became visible. The bench gained length. The cabinet no longer stood at the edge of shadow. The cracked panes required different patience. She removed each broken piece wearing Amos's leather gloves, setting shards into a coffee tin so none would end in a shoe sole later. 1 crack in the front shop window ran from upper left to lower right, but had not yet opened. She could have left it. Cold argued for haste. But when afternoon sun touched the crack, it split light across the counter in a bright wound. Ada removed it the next morning and set salvaged glass in its place. The sash cords were worse. The front windows had counterweights hidden inside side pockets, their original cotton cords broken long ago. Ada opened the access panel with a screwdriver and found the iron weight resting at the bottom like a small buried engine part. Amos had shown her the knot twice at the store, making her tie it until she could do it without looking. "Figure 8, he said. "Not a granny." "Yes, sir." "Weight drops, fingers go with it." "Yes, sir." She threaded 1/4-inch cotton cord over the pulley, tied the figure 8 knot through the eye of the counterweight, and tested the lift inch by inch. The first sash rose crooked. She lowered it, adjusted, found the opposite cord frayed, and replaced that too. By evening, both front windows could open 6 inches and stay there without a stick propped under them. It felt extravagant, this obedience of old mechanisms. She saved the original wavy pane for last. Not to repair, to clean. The east back room window had been painted shut for decades. Its putty had hardened but held. The glass itself bent reflections slightly, making the walnut branches outside appear to move even when wind stilled. Ada cleaned around it with a rag barely damp, touching the surface as little as possible. In one lower corner, under grime, she found faint scratching in the wood, ELV 1901. Not display, not proclamation, a mark made where only work would see it. She left it uncovered. On the final February afternoon of the window work, snow began again, not heavily, just a few flakes turning in the air beyond the back room. Ada stood on the inside of the last repaired sash, smoothing putty with the edge of the knife. Her hands had learned the pressure, the line came clean from corner to corner. Outside, on a walnut branch near the glass, a chickadee landed. It was so small the branch hardly moved. Black cap, white cheek, grey back. The bird turned its head once and looked through the new pane into the room where the bench had been cleaned. The floor had been oiled, the chimney had drawn smoke cleanly, and the hidden dyes had been wrapped again in their boxes. Ada held still with the putty knife in her hand. The chickadee flicked its tail, tapped the branch with its feet, and lifted away toward the creek. Only after it vanished did she breathe out. She finished the corner, wiped the knife, and set it on the sill. Through 8 windows, some salvaged, some repaired, one left old enough to keep its wavering memory. The workshop had begun to receive the light without losing the past that had shaped it. 2 winters later, in December of 2024, Ada made the first seal that she allowed to leave the workshop. She had made many before it, though none had crossed the counter into another person's hand. Practice seals filled a shallow tray near the bench. Crooked initials, uneven borders, flowers cut too deep, letters reversed correctly but spaced without grace, vines that crowded themselves, birds whose wings had become leaves by necessity rather than design. She kept them all. Mistakes did not belong in trash, simply because they had told the truth. The commissioned seal was for a woman named Mrs. Helen Ashby, who owned the used bookstore beside Mellinger's Hardware, and wrote letters to her grandchildren on cream paper every Sunday evening. She did not want a family crest. She did not want anything that looked inherited from a house with columns. "Just an H," Mrs. Ashby had said, standing at the counter in a brown coat dusted with snow. "And maybe a little lamp if that is not too foolish." Ada had drawn 3 versions before touching copper. The first was too decorative, the second too narrow. The third sat properly in the circle, an upright H with a small reading lamp worked into the crossbar, the shade no bigger than a lentil. She transferred the design in reverse and cut under lamplight, using the fine burin from the hidden drawer only after sharpening and testing it on scrap. The copper held, her hand weighted. When she pressed the finished die into dark blue wax, the impression rose clean. The H stood exact. The little lamp glowed without flame. Around it, a border of small dots held the design in modest order. Ada let the wax cool, then lifted the seal and looked at what pressure, heat, metal, and patience had agreed to make. She wrapped it in tissue and placed it in a square box, lined with paper she had cut by hand. By then the workshop had become a place with winter habits. The stove drew cleanly through the mended chimney. The roof did not drip into bowls. The windows admitted light without surrendering heat too easily. The backroom floor held its dark honey sheen beneath a braided rug near the bench. Shelves once buried in dust now carried labelled jars of rosin, beeswax, pigment, lampblack, shellac, gum arabic, and powdered ochre. The front room counter had been rubbed with oil until the walnut grain showed like slow water under brown glass. Nothing was extravagant. The chair behind the counter had one replaced rung. The stove door still needed lifting before the latch caught. The sign outside had not been repainted, only cleaned and sealed, so the old letters remained weathered, with one new line added beneath in Ada's careful hand. Hand-engraved seals, wax stationery repair. The red tile still bore its cracked corner near the door. The east window still bent the trees outside into a wavering world. She had kept the house from pretending. On the morning after Mrs. Ashby collected her seal, Ada carried a kettle of warm water out to the walnut near the creek. Snow had fallen in the night, only 2 inches, light enough for rabbit tracks to show under the branches. The horseshoe remained fixed in the bark where Eleanor had described it, rust held tight by living wood. Ada brushed snow from the trunk and saw below the horseshoe, and slightly to the left, a brass plate she had not noticed before the previous spring. It had been hidden under lichen. Months earlier she had cleaned around it with a soft brush, but had not forced it open. At its centre was a keyhole no larger than a thumbnail, dark, and almost swallowed by tarnish. The brass key from the small oak box had waited on the mantel all that time, its bow shaped like a little flame rising from a burin. Ada had not known what it opened. Now, in the clean light of December, she brought the key outside. It entered stiffly. She turned it with both hands, not because the lock was large, but because the moment deserved steadiness. Something inside the trunk gave a small click. A narrow panel, fitted so closely into the bark that age had made it nearly invisible, loosened along one side. Ada eased it open. Inside the hollow was a tin cylinder wrapped in oilcloth. She carried it inside before opening it. On the workbench, beside the first completed order still recorded in her ledger, she untied the cloth and lifted the lid. Within lay a folded flag, its fabric aged to a soft cream, with 48 stars arranged in even rows. Beneath it was a note written on paper thinner than Eleanor's letter, but preserved by dryness and care. Ada unfolded it. The note was dated November 11th, 1918. The hand was Eleanor Lydia Vale's. To the one who finds this later, this flag was given to me this morning, the day the guns stopped in Europe, though not all grief has stopped with them. Elias will not come home to stand beneath it. Samuel has returned breathing, which is not the same as whole, and I'm learning not to ask the living to prove they are unbroken before I welcome them. I have placed the flag here because the tree has held worse weather than my heart can hold today. If our family keeps this shop, let the flag be brought out only with reverence. If our family loses this shop, let whoever finds it know that a woman once stood under this walnut and promised that private work and public sorrow both require clean hands. Do not make display of what was paid for dearly. Remember them by repairing what you can. ELV. Ada read the note standing. Then she folded it along its existing lines and placed it beside the medal-marked ELV 1918. For a long while the shop held no sound except the stove and the faint ticking of cooling metal. Outside, the walnut tree stood with its small hidden door open, snow resting in the ridges of bark. She did not hang the flag in the window. She did not photograph it. She did not make it a story for the cafe or a reason for people to come stare through the glass. She refolded it with clean hands, wrapped it again, and placed it in a new archival box ordered from a conservation supplier in Philadelphia. The box cost more than she wanted to spend. She paid for it by selling 3 sets of handmade wax sticks, each poured from the old ratio Eleanor had written down. On November 11th, 2024, Ada had already taken the medal to the cemetery. She chose Lancaster Cemetery because Amos, after reading the initials and the old county records with her, had found an Elias Lawrence Vernon listed among the local men honoured after the First World War, though his body rested overseas. The morning was cold, with dry leaves gathered against the bases of stones. Ada stood before the memorial marker with the medal in both hands and waited while the bells downtown struck 11. She did not know Elias. She did not pretend to. She set a small wreath of wintergreen at the base of the marker, then held the medal long enough for the ribbon to move once in the wind. A caretaker driving a mower slowed, removed his cap, and continued without speaking. That was enough. Some honours are strongest when they are not made larger than the person they name. The money from the hidden compartment had lasted because Ada had treated it as a trust rather than rescue. She spent only what the workshop required and kept records exact enough to satisfy even Mrs. First: roof materials, chimney supplies, window glass, putty, sash cord, taxes, stovepipe, food when labour demanded food, medicine once, when a winter cough settled too deep. She sold no heirloom dies. She sold no family ledger. She sold no medal, no tool, no flag, no photograph, no object whose meaning was not hers alone to reduce. Only 3 coins from the cash had left her keeping. One more Mercury dime paid the postage on her first letter to a conservator in Philadelphia, enclosed with modern stamps because the dime itself stayed in the envelope only as a tracing and a question of date. 1 wheat penny was pressed into the wet plaster near the back room door, hidden where no eye would see it, because Jonah said every repaired place deserved a witness. 1 barber quarter was given to Amos after she closed the ledger account in full. He tried to refuse it. "That is not payment," she said. "What is it then?" "Proof." He looked at the coin, then at her, then slipped it into the small watch pocket of his work trousers. The rest remained sealed in the false-bottom drawer, counted, wrapped and labelled for the next one. Ada wrote those words herself on a piece of acid-free paper, "Not mine," for the next one. She did not yet know who that would be, and she did not need to know. Inheritance was not weakened by waiting. The shop reopened without a ribbon, without a newspaper photograph, without speeches. It began with 1 index card pinned to the corkboard inside the Copper Kettle Cafe, between a notice for piano lessons and a handwritten offer of firewood delivery. Doris, the cafe owner, had written the heading because Ada's own hand became too exact when nervous. Vale daughter seals. Hand-cut wax seals, small stationery repairs, custom wax sticks, by appointment, patient work, no rush orders. Below that, Ada had added a phone number borrowed through the cafe during open hours, and later a mailing address through the post office box. Mrs. First helped her file properly. By spring, 43 names sat on a mailing list kept in a blue ledger. Mrs. Ashby from the bookstore, Reverend Boyd, 2 attorneys from Lancaster, a bride who wanted no glitter, a widow who brought her husband's initials folded inside a handkerchief, 3 calligraphers, phone bank president who accepted Ada's refusal to copy a historical crest he had no right to use, and a schoolteacher who asked for a classroom seal reading "Read slowly." Ada made that one at cost. The boy who brought the final sign arrived in late April, older by 2 years, and taller than the splitting maul he had once carried to her woodpile. Caleb rode up on the same Schwinn bicycle, though its rear fender had been hammered straighter and the handle grips replaced with black tape. Across his back was a long shape wrapped in a bedsheet and tied with twine. Ada heard him before she saw him, tires on gravel, breath short from the hill. "You busy?" he asked from the doorway. "Yes," Ada said, then looked up from the bench. "But not too busy." He stepped inside and leaned the wrapped object against the counter. His hair had grown into his eyes. His wrists had outpaced his sleeves. He smelled of sawdust and cold air. "My shop teacher let me use the good chisels." Ada wiped her hands and came around the counter. Caleb untied the twine with exaggerated care, pretending not to care whether she cared. The bedsheet fell away from a hand-carved wooden sign. The board was walnut, not new but planed, sanded, oiled, and cut with letters deep enough to hold shadow. "Vale daughters." Plural. Ada read it once, then again. The added S was not crowded. Caleb had spaced the word as if he had understood the whole history of the shop and made room for those who had been left outside the line. The letters were imperfect. 1A leaned slightly. The ampersand was too ambitious and therefore beautiful. Along the bottom edge, he had carved a small burin and a flame. "My mother said it should say that," he said, "because of your grandfather, and the woman before him, and you." Ada touched the lower edge of the board. "What do I owe you?" He made the face of a boy insulted by arithmetic. Nothing. Caleb. He shifted his weight. Then teach me how to sharpen a tool right. Not today, sometime. Ada looked from the sign to the bench to the rack of gravers to the sealed boxes in the cabinet to the window where afternoon light bent through old glass. Sometime can be Saturday, she said. He nodded once, trying and failing to hide the brightness in his face. They hung the sign beneath the old one, not replacing it, not correcting it, only answering it. Vale Daughter remained above, weathered and original. Vale Daughters stood below, darker, younger, patient enough to age. That night after Caleb rode home and the cafe lights went out down the road, Ada sat at the counter with a sheet of cream paper before her. She had delayed this task longer than any repair. The house was warm, the stove held a low fire, the tools had been cleaned and rolled, the first page of her new ledger lay open to the left, the old ledger closed to the right. Eleanor's letter rested in its protective folder near the lamp. Ada had read it many times, though never carelessly. Each reading seemed to return one instruction and conceal another for later. Now she uncapped her fountain pen. For several minutes she wrote nothing. Outside, the creek moved in darkness. A moth touched the window once, mistaking lamplight for moon. Ada placed her left hand flat on the counter and listened to the building as she had listened on the first night, back when she had owned nothing but paper, hunger, and a door that could be locked from the inside. Then she wrote the opening words. My dear one, whoever you are. She paused after the period. She did not know who would read it. A niece not yet born, a student, a stranger, a woman with a careful hand, a boy who had learned that a tool should be sharpened before work, someone hungry, someone proud, someone who had lost a room, someone who had never lost a room but was willing to keep faith with one. Ada wrote slowly, telling only what belonged to telling. She wrote that the money had been preserved, not spent into vanity. She wrote where the key had fit. She wrote which roof seam had failed first, which chimney joints needed watching, which window must never be replaced unless broken beyond mercy. She wrote the wax ratio, though. Eleanor had written it better. She wrote Amos Reed's name, Mrs. First's name, Jonah Klein's, Doris's, Reverend Boyd's, Caleb's. She wrote that small kindnesses had built more of the shop than timber. Near midnight, she set down the pen. The letter was not finished. It did not need to be finished in one night. Some inheritances should be written over years, with margins left for weather. She folded the unfinished pages into a temporary envelope and placed them in the 7th drawer, above the false bottom, not yet hidden below it. The future could wait without being forgotten. In the seasons that followed, people came quietly. They came one at a time, usually after seeing the cafe card or receiving a sealed envelope from someone who had. They stood at the counter and lowered their voices without being asked. They brought initials, old stationery, a broken seal handle from a grandfather's desk, a box of letters tied with ribbon, a question about morning wax, a request for wedding invitations that did not glitter or shout. Ada listened. She asked Silas's 3 questions before every commission. What must it say? Who must trust it? What should it never pretend? Some customers answered quickly and had to be asked again. Some stood in silence until the true answer rose. Those were often the best commissions. The workshop did not become famous. It did not need to. Its mailing list grew slowly. Its ledger balanced with effort. The stove still required tending. The pump still complained after hard freezes. The walnut tree still held its hidden chamber. The 7th drawer still closed shorter than the others. The old dies remained wrapped and catalogued, not displayed, because trust is not decoration. On winter evenings, when the last appointment had gone and the road darkened beyond the windows, Ada sometimes lit a beeswax candle and set it beside Eleanor's letter. She would sharpen a graver, test a line on copper, or pour wax into warmed moulds while snow gathered along the sill. The room would smell of pine rosin, honey, lamp black, warmed metal, and the faint mineral cold that old brick never entirely gives up. The house had been waiting, and now she was waiting with it. A wax seal workshop waits. It waits in the grain of a walnut counter for a hand willing to rub oil into what has dried. It waits in drawers whose labels have faded but not surrendered their meaning. It waits in tools wrapped against rust, in copper hidden from careless markets, in a chimney repaired one joint at a time, in a floor that asks every hurried foot to slow down. It waits for someone who understands that small work can hold large trust. It waits for letters to be closed with care, for grief to be given a border, for joy to be marked without shouting, for private promises to receive the dignity of pressure and flame. It waits through fashion, abandonment, paperwork, winter, silence, and the long seasons when no one living remembers why a sign was painted the way it was. A wax seal workshop waits. It has always waited. And in the county clerk's office, in a narrow drawer beneath receipts, dog license forms, and old carbon paper, Mrs. Helen First kept the $5 bill. She had not deposited it. She had written the receipt correctly. She had balanced the account from her own purse at the end of that week and placed Ada's worn bill in an envelope marked Repository Sale, Vale Parcel. The paper had softened from its time in a shoe, a pocket, a hay barn, and a young woman's last season without shelter. Sometimes when new clerks asked why an old $5 bill sat in a drawer where no money should be, Mrs. First would remove it, lay it flat on the counter, and tell them only what was necessary. That, she would say, bought a door. Then she would put it back, smooth the envelope once with her palm, and return to the quiet work of keeping records for a county where some forgotten places were not finished yet.